Hey, welcome back to Game of Theories. We've got something fire today. What if Maester Aemon confessed Jon's true name before he died? Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1. The last breath of a Targaryen, the cinnamon wind smelled of salt and rot and the particular sweetness of dying. Sam had grown used to it over the past 3 days, the way the smell clung to the wood of the cabin walls, worked itself into the rough-spun blankets, settled into the back of his throat so that even when he went up on deck to breathe the open sea air, he could still taste it. It wasn't a cruel smell, not exactly. It was just the smell of a body that had been in the world a very long time and was finally, slowly, releasing its grip on it. Maester Aemon lay on the narrow bunk with his hands folded over his chest, his breathing so shallow that Sam had to watch for the slight rise and fall of the blanket to be sure he was still with them. The old man's face was a map of everything he had survived, 102 years of it, wars and winters and the deaths of everyone he had ever loved, all of it written in the lines around his eyes and mouth. Even like this, even diminished to almost nothing, there was something in that face that commanded the space around it. Gilly sat on a low stool near the bunk, nursing little Sam, watching the old man with an expression that Sam had come to recognize as her particular form of grief, practical and quiet and very deep. She had never known anyone who lived to be 102. She had barely known anyone who lived past 30. Aemon was something outside her experience of the world, and she had attached herself to him with a tenderness that still surprised Sam whenever he saw it. "He's been trying to say something," she told Sam when he ducked back through the low cabin door, his head nearly catching the beam above it. His lips keep moving, but nothing comes out. Sam crossed the cabin and pulled the three-legged stool close to Aemon's bunk and sat on it, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Maester Aemon," he said softly, "it's Sam, I'm here." The old man's clouded eyes moved toward the sound of his voice. Aemon had been blind most of his long life, but his hearing had stayed sharp well into his final decade, and even now, fading as he was, there was something alert in his face when he recognized a familiar voice. His lips moved. Sam leaned closer. "The boy," Aemon breathed. Each word was a separate effort. "Snow." "Yes," Sam said. He reached out and placed his hand over the old man's folded ones. The skin there felt like old paper, thin and dry, the bones beneath it fragile as a sparrow's. "Jon Snow, he's still at Castle Black. Sam stopped himself. He had no idea what Jon was. The last raven had said nothing good. Not Snow. The old man's jaw tightened with what looked like frustration, the stubbornness of a man who has something urgent to say and can feel the time for saying it closing around him like water. "Not Snow, never Snow." Gilly looked up from the baby. She and Sam exchanged a glance over the old man's body. "What do you mean?" Sam said. He kept his voice even, though something was beginning to move in his chest, a foreboding he couldn't name. "What is he if not Snow?" Aemon's hand turned beneath Sam's. He gripped Sam's fingers with a strength that seemed impossible given the rest of him, the grip of a man who had been strong once and some part of him hadn't forgotten. "Listen," he said, "listen carefully. I have carried this too long. I should have told someone years ago, but I was afraid. I was a coward about this one thing." "You are not a coward," Sam said. "I was." The old man coughed softly, and Sam saw the slight trembling in his chest as he fought through it. "I am a Targaryen, Sam. I have always known what we are capable of. And I knew what would happen to the boy if the wrong people learned the truth of him, so I kept it." A long pause, the rattle of breath. I kept it, and now I am dying and I will take it with me unless—" "Tell me," Sam said. His heart was beating very fast now, the kind of fast it got when something important was happening and he couldn't yet see the shape of it. "Whatever it is, tell me now." Aemon turned his face toward the ceiling. His breathing steadied slightly, as if the act of making this decision had given him some small reservoir of strength to draw from. "Rhaegar," he said, and even now, in this wasted voice, the name had weight. "My great-nephew. Know what they say about him, the Mad King's son, the prince who stole Lyanna Stark and started a war." "Yes, he did not steal her." Aemon's voice was very quiet. "He loved her, and she loved him. I do not ask you to understand it. The world is rarely as simple as the stories we tell about it. Rhaegar set aside his marriage to Elia Martell, and he and Lyanna were wed in secret in a godswood in Dorne with only 2 witnesses who are now long dead." His fingers tightened again on Sam's. "They were wed, Sam, lawfully wed under the eyes of the gods. It was not abduction. It was never abduction." The cabin felt very small. Sam could hear the creak of the ship's hull, the sound of the sea moving against the wood, the soft sound of little Sam feeding. He felt as though the world had just quietly, without announcement, become a different size. "Lyanna bore Rhaegar a son," Aemon continued, "at the Tower of Joy in Dorne while the war ended outside its walls. Ned Stark rode to his sister and found her dying in a bed of blood. She made him promise. She made him take the child and keep him safe from Robert Baratheon, who would have put the babe to the sword before he could speak his name. Ned Stark was an honorable man. The trace of something, affection, admiration, sorrow, crossed the old man's face. He gave his sister what she asked for. He took the child home as his own bastard and shamed himself before the world and bore that shame for the rest of his life, rather than let a child die for his father's name. Sam could not speak. He was aware of Gilly watching him, aware of the sound of his own breathing. The boy's name, Aemon said, his true name, the name his mother gave him before she died, is Aegon. A pause. Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Trueborn, legitimate. Another pause, smaller and more final. The rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sam had ever heard. He sat there with the old man's hand in his and stared at the far wall of the cabin and felt the weight of what he had just been told settling onto his shoulders the way snow settles. Gently, gradually, and then all at once impossibly heavy. Jon, Sam said. It was barely a word, it was just breath shaped like a name. Jon Snow is Aegon Targaryen, Aemon said. Some of the tension went out of him, the tension of years, Sam thought, the particular tension of a secret too long held. He does not know, Ned Stark never told him. Ned died before he could. And now it falls to you, Sam, you who knew him, you who loved him as a brother. Me, Sam said. You, the old man's eyes found him with unsettling accuracy for a man who had been blind for decades. I should have told him myself. I had chances. I was afraid of what it would do to him, to the watch, to the careful, quiet life Ned Stark died to protect. I made excuses, and now, he stopped, coughed again. This time it lasted longer, and when it ended he was visibly smaller, as if each cough was taking something fundamental with it. Now you must tell him, and you must not delay. The world is not a safe place for that name to be wandering around without its owner. I will, Sam said. I swear it, Maester Aemon, I will tell him. Aemon nodded slowly once. Good, he said, good boy. He closed his eyes. He did not open them again. He died before the next morning came. Quietly between one breath and the next, so that Sam, dozing in the chair beside him, only realized it when the quality of the silence in the cabin changed. He woke and looked at Aemon's face and knew immediately. There was no drama to it, no final words, no grand gestures, just the slow ceasing of a thing that had been going on for 102 years. Sam sat with him for a long time. Then he got up, went to the small writing chest that Aemon had brought aboard, found parchment and ink and a quill, and sat down on the stool and thought for a very long time about what he was going to write. Gilly came to stand behind him. She put her hand on his shoulder. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to write it down, Sam said, all of it exactly as he told me, and then I'm going to send it to Jon. He dipped the quill and held it over the parchment, and his hand was not entirely steady. Aemon was right. The world is not safe for that name wandering around without its owner. What if the letter is read by someone else first? Sam thought about that. Then I'll write it so that only Jon will understand the most important parts, he said. And I'll send 2 copies by different routes, and I'll pray to whatever gods are listening that at least one of them finds him. He started to write. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote down everything Aemon had said, every detail, every name. He wrote about Rhaegar and Lyanna and the secret marriage in Dorne. He wrote about the Tower of Joy and the promise Ned Stark had made to his dying sister. He wrote Jon's true name in letters that felt different from any other letters he had ever formed, larger somehow, heavier on the page. He wrote his own witness to Aemon's dying confession, and he signed it, and then he wrote it again on a second sheet and signed that too. He sealed both copies with wax. He addressed them to Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Castle Black, the Wall. Then he sat and looked at them. He could already be dead, he said quietly. The raven that had reached them 2 weeks out from Braavos had spoken of trouble at the Wall, of wildlings and treachery and blood on the snow. Sam had tried not to think about what that meant. He was very good at not thinking about things that were too large to think about. He had learned that at Horn Hill under his father's contempt, and he had used it ever since as a survival skill. But now the skill wasn't working. He could be, Gilly said. But he might not be. Right, Sam said. Right, he might not be. He picked up the letters. I'll ask the captain about the ravens. The ravens they sent went 3 different ways. The captain of the Cinnamon Wind, a broad-shouldered summer islander named Quahuru Mo, had 2 ravens aboard for emergencies and was willing to part with one for a price that Sam paid out of the meager coins he had left. The second letter he gave to a merchant vessel they passed near the coast, whose captain claimed to be making for a port near White Harbor, and who, for another coin, agreed to have it sent north from there. The first raven was released from the deck at dawn, watched by Sam and Gilly and little Sam. who watched everything with the same wide-eyed gravity he brought to all his observations of the world. The bird circled once over the ship, getting its bearings, and then it was gone into the gray sky, a black dot growing smaller and then nothing. Sam stood at the rail and watched it go and felt the enormous fragility of what he had just done. A letter, 2 letters, carried by birds and boats and luck and the gods, making their way toward a man who might already be dead, carrying a secret that could change the shape of the world. He went below and slept because there was nothing else to do. At Castle Black, 3 weeks before the cinnamon wind released its raven into the gray sky, Jon Snow had been stabbed. He did not think of it as a betrayal in the moment it happened, though it was. He had known for weeks that something was wrong, had felt it in the way conversations stopped when he walked into rooms, had seen it in the careful neutral expressions of men he had thought were his friends. He knew the signs of a conspiracy building. He had grown up in a castle, and castles were places where conspiracies built like weather systems, slow-moving and inevitable. He had noted it and filed it away and done nothing, because he had not been afraid, and because he had been too tired to manage one more problem in addition to everything else. That, he would later think, had been arrogant of him. Bowen Marsh said for the watch before the first blade went in, and Jon heard that and had time to think before the pain arrived. They came from 3 sides. The knives were cold, colder than he expected, and then almost immediately very hot, and he went down slowly, the way buildings go down, not all at once but piece by piece, his legs first, then his hands finding the ground, then the side of his face against the cold stone of the courtyard. He lay there and watched the blood spread in a dark halo around him in the snow, and he thought about Ghost, who was howling somewhere close by, and about the wall, and about his father. Ned's face came to him clearly, not the face from the sept at King's Landing, where Sam had heard that it had all ended, but the face from Winterfell, from the yard where they had trained together on cold mornings, the face of a man trying to say something with his eyes that he did not know how to say with words. "You have more Stark in you than you know, Jon," that was what he had always said, as if he knew the comparison was unfair, as if he was apologizing for something. "You have more Stark in you than you know." Jon closed his eyes. The cold came up to meet him. He was dead for some indeterminate time. He did not experience the death the way he might have expected. There was no darkness, no tunnel, no door between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. There was simply a moment of being in his body, and then a very long period of being nowhere at all, not dark, not cold, not anything, just absence, and then without any clear transition, he was back. He woke on the stone table in the ice cell and gasped like a man surfacing from water. The gasp woke Melisandre, who was sitting in a chair a few feet away in the state of exhausted half-sleep that comes after many hours of concentrated effort, and she came to her feet with her eyes already open and reached him in 2 steps, pressing her hand flat against his chest as if she needed to feel his heart beating to believe it. He stared up at her. She looked as though she were seeing something she had prayed for so long she had stopped believing in it. "Azor Ahai," she breathed. "Don't," Jon said. His voice was wrecked, scraped out of him, barely voice at all. "Don't start." She pulled her hand back. Something moved across her face, not offense, he thought, but surprise. As if she had expected him to be grateful or frightened or transformed, and he was simply himself, which was somehow stranger than any of those. He pushed himself upright on the table, slowly testing. The wounds were there, he could feel the phantom memory of them, the places on his body where the knives had gone, but the flesh was closed. He touched his side through the rough linen tunic. Smooth, he pressed. No pain. "How long?" he said. "Since last night," Tormund said from the doorway. Sam had not been there to do what Tormund helped do, but Tormund was a man who understood that some things required doing and asking questions about them afterward. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and looking at Jon with the particular expression of a man who is refusing to show how frightened he has been. "They kept you in here. The Red Woman's been at it for hours. Bowen Marsh. In a cell, so are the others." Tormund's jaw tightened. "What do you want done with them?" Jon got off the table. His legs held. He stood for a moment in the ice cell with its single torch and its smell of cold stone, and felt himself in his own body in a way that was both familiar and entirely new, as though he had stepped back into a house he knew perfectly well, but the house had been very briefly empty and the emptiness had changed the quality of the air inside. "Gather everyone in the yard," he said. "Everyone, wildlings, crows, all of them." "Jon, everyone, Tormund." He looked at the wildling. "Please." Tormund looked at him for a moment, then uncrossed his arms and pushed off the doorframe. "Aye," he said, "give me an hour." They gathered in the yard in the early morning cold, stamping their feet and breathing mist, watching him with the mixture of fear and awe and suspicion that Jon supposed was a reasonable response to seeing a man stand upright who had been dead the night before. He stood on the steps above them and looked at their faces, Black brothers and wildlings and the few others who had found their way to Castle Black for one reason or another, and felt nothing that he would have identified as fear. Melisandre stood to his right. Tormund to his left, Ghost pressed against his leg, quiet and immense, his red eyes moving slowly across the assembled crowd. Jon let the silence sit for a moment. "You all know what happened," he said. He did not raise his voice especially. The cold air carried it. "You all know what was done. Some of you agree with the men who did it, and if you do, I want you to know that I understand. I made a choice that many of you thought was wrong. I still believe it was right, but I understand why you disagreed with it." The yard was very quiet. "But this is over," Jon said. "The watch I served was a thing worth dying for, and I proved that last night. I'm done with it." He reached up and unfastened his cloak, the black cloak, the cloak of the Night's Watch, and he took it off with both hands and held it for a moment and then let it fall to the steps below him. "My watch is ended." The effect of that was immediate, a ripple through the crowd, voices rising and dropping again, people looking at each other, looking at the black cloak pooled on the steps. Jon watched them process it and did not wait for a response. "The dead are coming," he said. "You know this. Every man and woman here who has been beyond the wall knows this. The question is not whether they are coming, the question is whether anyone south of this wall is going to be ready for them. And right now," he looked out at them, all of them, the living people he was responsible for, "right now they are not." He came down the steps, the crowd parted around him. He walked toward the cells where Bowen Marsh and the conspirators were held, and Tormund fell in beside him, and Ghost padded at his heel, and Melisandre came 3 steps behind with her red robes burning in the gray morning like a coal refusing to go out. He hanged them at midday, not out of cruelty. Jon had no cruelty in him for this. What he felt, if anything, was something blunter and sadder than cruelty, a kind of hollow necessity. But the Night's Watch had its laws, and the laws said a man who killed his Lord Commander died for it, and Jon intended to be the last Lord Commander, so there was a certain grim fitness in upholding that law one final time. Bowen Marsh wept when they brought him out. He had been weeping for most of the time since his cell, his face red and crumpled with it, and he looked up at Jon with eyes full of a wretchedness that Jon found genuinely painful to see, because Marsh was not a bad man. He was a frightened, small-souled man who had made a terrible choice because he could not see past the boundary of what he knew, but he was not a bad man. "I did it for the watch," Marsh said. It came out between sobs, strangled and hopeless. "I know," Jon said. "You were going to destroy everything we built, perhaps, or perhaps I was going to save it." Jon held the man's gaze. "We'll never know now." Marsh looked at him with something that might have been, under different circumstances, the beginning of understanding. It came too late for anything useful. Jon gave the order. It was done quickly, which was the only mercy available. Afterward he stood in the yard and looked at what had been accomplished and felt the full weight of what he had become, or what he was becoming, the shape of it not yet clear to him, a thing still deciding its own form. Around him the watch's routines continued, men at their posts, the unchanging cold, the wall behind it all like a cliff face of blue-white ice climbing impossibly into the sky. He had given 16 years of his life to standing beneath that wall. He had given his life to it, literally, and gotten it back, and now he was walking away. He was walking away, and he did not know where he was going. The thought was not frightening, it was something else. Something that felt, and this surprised him, like the first breath after a long time underwater. The raven from Old Town arrived 6 days later. It came at night, knocking against the rookery window with that particular persistence that ravens have when they have been traveling hard and long, and have a destination burned into them that they will achieve or die trying. The man on rook duty, a young black brother named Pip, who had not been part of Marsh's conspiracy, and who was now navigating the aftermath of the purge with the careful diplomatic instincts of a man who understood which way wind was blowing, came for Jon immediately. Jon was in the great hall eating bread and not thinking, which had become his primary occupation in the past week. He got up and followed Pip to the rookery and found the raven perched on the ledge with a letter case on its leg, and its feathers ruffled with exhaustion and affront. He detached the case, opened it. He read the letter once, quickly, the way he read everything first, for the shape of it, the outline of what was being said. Then he read it again, slowly, the way it deserved to be read. When he finished the second reading, he stood very still in the rookery with the letter in his hands, and the raven watching him with its bright old black eyes, and the candle throwing unsteady light across the words Sam had written. "Jon, I write this with a shaking hand, and beg you to read it to the end before you decide I've lost my mind. Maester Aemon told me something in his final hours that I am obligated to pass to you, though I confess I am afraid to put it to paper, because once it is written, it is a thing that exists in the world in a way that cannot be undone. I am writing it anyway because he asked me to, and because I think the world has been misshapen by the keeping of the secret long enough. Sam's handwriting. That familiar, sprawling handwriting that had once covered dozens of library parchments in the depths of the Castle Black Library, careful and earnest and slightly too large for the space it was given. Jon would have known it anywhere. He read on. He read his true name written in ink on parchment by the hand of his closest friend, Aegon Targaryen. The name sat on the page and looked back at him. He stared at it for a long time. In the rookery, the raven made a small sound of ongoing impatience. He thought about Ned Stark. He thought about every time Ned had almost said something and then found other words. Every glance across a room that Jon had filed away under Northern Reserve or the Stark way of things. Every time his father had said, "You have more Stark in you than you know," and the particular quality that the word Stark had when Ned said it, as if he were choosing it very carefully from several options and not entirely comfortable with his choice. She made him promise. He thought about the promise. A man, a genuinely, fundamentally honorable man, the most honorable man Jon had ever known, carrying the shame of a bastard son for the rest of his life. Carrying it in public in front of a wife who deserved the truth, in front of a king who was his friend and who would have killed the truth if he'd heard it. Ned Stark, who could not lie about anything, lying about the most important thing in his life and doing it without complaint, without anyone ever knowing. That, Jon thought, was the most Ned Stark thing he had ever heard. He folded the letter, put it inside his shirt against his skin. He went back to the great hall and sat down and looked at the bread he had been eating and did not eat any more of it. "Something wrong?" Tormund asked. He was at the far end of the table, working through a large piece of salted beef with methodical determination. "No," Jon said. "Nothing wrong." He paused. "I need to leave the wall." Tormund stopped chewing. "Leave it. Go south. I don't know exactly where yet, but south." Jon looked at the fire. "There's something I need to do." Tormund looked at him for a long moment with those bright blue eyes that had seen more of the true world than most men ever would, and then he went back to his salted beef. "Right," he said. "When? Soon. How many people?" Jon considered. "A few. You, Melisandre, whether I want her or not." Ghost, he thought. "The wildlings need to come south of the wall before winter locks us in. I'll move them first, get them through the gate, get them moving toward," he paused, "toward Winterfell." "Your home," Tormund said. "My father's home," Jon said. Tormund looked at him again. Tormund was a perceptive man beneath the noise and the beard, and something in his face said he was reading something in Jon's that Jon hadn't said aloud, but he didn't push. He just nodded and returned to his meal. Jon stared at the fire. Aegon Targaryen. He tried the name on inside his head, the way you try on a coat in a cold room, examining the weight of it, the way the shoulders sat. It felt like wearing someone else's coat. It felt like it belonged to a figure from history, from the songs Sansa used to sing in Winterfell when they were children, songs about dragon riders and silver-haired princes and fires that conquered continents. It did not feel like a name for a man sitting in a cold hall eating bread and thinking about logistics. But then he supposed it had felt that way to the first Aegon once too. He touched the letter through his shirt. His father had died protecting this name. His mother had died believing in it. Maester Aemon, who had been born a Targaryen and chosen a wall and a lifetime of service over a crown, had spent his last breath making sure it didn't die with him. Jon Snow had been dead. For one night he had been nothing at all, not even a name, not even a memory, just the space where a person had been. And then he had come back. He was not a man who believed in accidents. Outside, the wall stood in the darkness. 100 leagues of ice, taller than any man-made thing in the living world, and beyond it the endless dark of the true north, where things were gathering that no name, not Snow, not Stark, not Targaryen, would be enough to hold back. The name was a beginning. Not an ending, not a solution, not a sword that solved anything by being drawn. Just a beginning, the kind that came from knowing the full truth of yourself for the first time, with all its weight and all its history pressing down, and choosing to stand under it rather than walk away. Jon Snow had walked away from a lot of things. Aegon Targaryen, if he was going to be that name, was not going to walk away from this. In the rookery, the tired raven from Oldtown finally tucked its head under its wing and slept. Below it, a folded letter sat inside a dead man's shirt, against a living man's heart. And in a camp somewhere between the wall and Winterfell, a second letter was making its way north by slower roads, carried by a merchant's boy who had no idea what he was carrying, toward people who had no idea what was coming, but who would, when it arrived, begin to understand that the world had just taken a turn that none of the old maps accounted for. The night was very cold and very quiet. The dead were still north of the wall, but not for long. Chapter 2, The Letter That Changed the Wind. The second letter arrived in Stannis Baratheon's camp on a Tuesday, though Stannis had largely stopped caring what day of the week it was, sometime around the third month of a siege that was supposed to have lasted 3 weeks. The camp outside Winterfell was not a place that inspired confidence. It had started as a military encampment and become, through attrition and cold and the grinding misery of a northern winter, something closer to a refugee settlement. Tents sagged under the weight of snow that never quite finished falling. Horses stood in their lines with their heads down, breath rising in slow columns. Men moved between fires with the careful economical movements of people conserving warmth, conserving energy, conserving what remained of their willingness to be here at all. Stannis sat in his command tent and read dispatches. He read them the way he did everything, thoroughly, without expression, with the complete focused attention of a man who believed that all problems yielded to sufficient concentration. He had a stack of them, reports from scouts, letters from the Iron Bank, a message from his castellan at Dragonstone that told him nothing useful in 300 words. He read each one and made a decision about it and moved it to a different pile and picked up the next. The merchant's boy came to the tent at mid-morning, escorted by 2 guards who were skeptical about both the boy and his errand. The boy was perhaps 14, red-cheeked with cold, clutching a sealed letter with both hands as if it might escape. He looked at Stannis the way people often looked at Stannis, as if they'd expected a king to look somehow different from this. "A letter, your grace," one of the guards said. "Merchant from White Harbor, says it came off a ship from the south. Says it's for the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch." "Then why is it here?" Stannis asked. "The merchant heard the Lord Commander was dead, your grace. Thought someone in authority should." "Give it to me." The guard handed it over. Stannis looked at the seal, plain red wax, no sigil, pressed with what looked like a thumb rather than a ring. He broke it and unfolded the parchment and began to read. He was a fast reader. He read the letter in perhaps 2 minutes, then he set it flat on the table in front of him and looked at it. "Leave," he said. The guards and the merchant's boy left. Stannis sat alone in his tent with the letter in front of him and the sounds of the camp outside, horses, wind, the distant ring of a hammer at the smithy, and he read it again, slower this time, with the particular care of a man who has learned not to trust the first impression of a thing that seems too consequential to be true. It was still the same letter on the second reading. He sat back. He pressed his jaw together in the way he had, grinding his teeth, a habit that his Maester had told him was destroying his molars and that Stannis had informed him was not relevant. He stared at the canvas wall of the tent. Aegon Targaryen, he knew the name. The original one, the Conqueror, was as familiar to any king of Westeros as the names of their own ancestors. But this Aegon, a living Aegon, a secret Aegon, the bastard of Winterfell grown up behind a wall with no idea what blood ran in him, this was a different kind of name. Stannis Baratheon had spent much of his adult life being the rightful king of a realm that persistently refused to acknowledge it. He had the best claim after Robert's line, which was itself, as this letter would suggest, perhaps shakier than anyone had publicly acknowledged. He had fought for his claim. He was still fighting for it in this frozen camp, in this God's-forsaken northern siege, fighting with what he had left after Blackwater had stripped him of everything except his conviction and his dwindling army. He was the rightful king. He repeated that to himself with regularity. He had found that it bore repetition. But if this letter was true, if Sam Tarly's account of a dying blind Maester's confession was accurate, then Stannis Baratheon's claim to the Iron Throne was roughly equivalent to a man's claim to a horse that had already been given to someone else. He picked up the letter again. The boy would need to be told. That was the first thing. Whatever else this changed, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, was alive, or had been alive when this was written, and the man deserved to know the truth of his own name from someone other than a letter that might have passed through a dozen hands. The second thing was the question of what Stannis himself did with this information. He was still considering the geometry of that question when Melisandre walked into his tent. She did not knock, she never knocked. Stannis had given up objecting to it some time ago on the grounds that his objections made no impression on her whatsoever. She came in with the cold air moving around her as if reluctant to touch her, and she looked at him with those red eyes that had never quite lost the quality of seeing something in him that he couldn't see in himself. She was wearing her red robes, and the ruby at her throat was lit from inside, throwing faint warmth onto the canvas walls. "You've had news," she said. "I always have news. I run a military campaign. News is the primary product. This news is different." She looked at the letter on the table. "May I? You'll read it whether I say yes or not." She picked it up and read it, and unlike Stannis, she showed something on her face while she did, not the calculated blankness he used, but genuine movement, something shifting and resolving behind her eyes. When she finished, she set it down and she looked at him, and her expression was the closest thing to naked that he had ever seen on her face. "I have been looking in the wrong place," she said quietly. "What? The fires?" She touched the ruby at her throat. "I have seen a man in the flames for years. A warrior, a wielder of light against the dark, I thought." She stopped. "I was so certain." Stannis looked at her flatly. "You told me I was the Lord's chosen, Azor Ahai reborn. The prince that was promised. You told me this with great confidence on a significant number of occasions. I was wrong." The silence after that was unusual. Melisandre was not a woman who admitted to being wrong. Stannis had catalogued her errors with the careful precision he brought to all record-keeping, and had never once heard her acknowledge a single one. He looked at her now with something that he would not have called surprise, because Stannis considered surprise to be a failure of preparation, but was functionally indistinguishable from it. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that everything you said, I saw fire and a great warrior and a darkness beaten back. I imposed a shape on the vision because I needed a shape, because I was here and you were here and the night was dark." She met his eyes. "I interpreted. Interpretation is not the same as truth." "No," Stannis said, "it is not." He looked at the letter between them on the table. "He was killed," Stannis said. "The letter says he was Lord Commander. There were reports of trouble at the wall." "He is not dead," Melisandre said. She said it with the absolute certainty of someone reading something off a surface only they can see. "The fires do not show me a dead man. The fires have shown you inaccurate things before. You just told me that." "Yes. And this I know with a certainty that is different in quality." She sat down across from him, something she rarely did. She usually stood, as if sitting reduced some advantage of height or presence. "Your Grace, I have done you a disservice. I told you things I believed, and some of them were wrong, and I am telling you now because you deserve the truth." She looked at him directly. "But the war I spoke of, the war against the dark, the long night coming, that is not wrong. That is in every vision, every flame, every shadow I have ever read. That war is real, and you believe Jon Snow is the key to winning it." "I believe Aegon Targaryen is," she said. "Whether he calls himself that or not." Stannis was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter, at the camp beyond his tent walls, at the problem that had been laid in his lap by a dying blind man on a ship somewhere in the Sunset Sea, and he did the thing he always did with problems. He thought about them until they resolved into components, and then he dealt with the components. "Bring me Davos," he said. Sir Davos Seaworth came in, smelling of horse and cold air, and the particular honestly earned tiredness of a man who had been up since before dawn doing things that needed doing. He was a small man, compact and quiet in his movements, with a sailor's ease in his body and a pair of careful eyes that Stannis had come to value more than the advice of half his lords combined. He looked at the letter on the table and then at Stannis and waited. "Read that," Stannis said. Davos read it. He was slower than Stannis, not from lack of intelligence. Davos was one of the most intelligently practical people Stannis had ever known, but because he had come to reading late in life, and he still gave it the full respect of something that had been hard-won. When he finished, he put the letter down and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," Davos said, "indeed, the boy's alive. Apparently, or was alive when this was written, and he doesn't know. Davos looked at the letter for another long moment. "This changes things." "Yes, Your Grace." Davos chose his next words with the care of a man navigating rocks in a shallow harbor. "I want to be useful to you here, not just honest, but I think you already know what I'm going to say. Say it anyway. If this is true, and I think it probably is, Maester Aemon was not a man known for lying, especially not at the hour of his death, then your claim to the throne is, well..." He paused. "It's not the strongest position you've ever been in. My claim was never based on Targaryen precedent. My claim comes from Robert's right of conquest and from being Robert's heir after his trueborn children were revealed as bastards." "Right," Davos said, "but if there's a legitimate Targaryen heir, then half the realm that swallowed their doubts and bent the knee to Robert will have cause to reconsider." Stannis picked up the letter, folded it, set it down. "I know, Davos, I have thought through the implications. So what do we do?" Stannis looked at the letter. He looked at Melisandre, who was watching him with the expression of a woman, waiting to see what kind of man he turned out to be in the specific crucible of this specific moment. He looked at Davos, who was doing the same thing but less dramatically. "We do what is right," Stannis said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, with the slightly exasperated quality of a man who considers it a personal failing that not everyone simply does what is right as a matter of course. "Jon Snow needs to know who he is," and then he paused. "We speak to him." "Speak to him," Davos repeated carefully. "There is a war coming that will make the Game of Thrones look like children arguing over a toy. You both know this. I have 8,000 men, half-starved and frozen. Jon Snow has wildlings and whatever remains of the Night's Watch, and if this letter is accurate, he has a name that will bring the North to its feet. He looked at Davos. 2 claimants fighting each other hands the kingdom to the dead. 2 claimants who are intelligent enough to recognize that fact could win it. Davos finished. Could win it, Stannis agreed. Melisandre was very still. She was watching Stannis with something that was not quite the zealot's adoration she usually wore, something more complicated and more honest. That is a wise course, she said quietly. It is the only logical course, Stannis said, which was how he expressed wisdom. 2 days later, Davos Seaworth rode north with a small escort and a letter written in Stannis Baratheon's own hand, brief, precise, military in its economy of language. It contained no flattery and no threats and no elaborately constructed courtly language. It said, I know who you are, we should speak. He also carried, tucked inside his coat, Sam Tarly's original letter, which Stannis had decided Jon Snow had a right to hold with his own hands. The road north through the snow was not pleasant. Davos had ridden worse roads, sailed worse seas, and survived worse circumstances. Blackwater Bay alone had included an explosion that should have killed him, and hadn't, only because the sea had taken him first and the cold water had doused the fire. He was not a man who wasted energy on discomfort that couldn't be improved. He rode, and he thought, and he watched the white landscape move past him, and he thought about Jon Snow. He had met the boy once, briefly, when Stannis had come to the wall for dragonglass and counsel. He remembered a young man with dark eyes and the quality of stillness that the best fighters had, not the stillness of passivity but the stillness of something conserving itself, like a bowstring held at full draw. He remembered thinking that the boy was going to be important to something, though he hadn't known what yet. He knew now. He reached Castle Black on the 3rd day, cold to the marrow and saddle-sore in a way that was going to take a week to forget, and he was brought to Jon Snow in the great hall, where the man was standing over a table covered in maps with 3 wildling captains and a red-haired woman who looked at Davos when he entered with a directness that he found unsettling. Jon looked up from the map. He looked different from the boy Davos had met at the wall. The eyes were the same, that same dark, still quality, but there was something else in his face now, something that happened to people who had been through something fundamental and come out the other side of it changed in a way they hadn't yet finished understanding. He looked at Davos without surprise, as if the arrival of a king's envoy at this particular moment was something he had been half expecting. Sir Davos, he said, I wondered when Stannis would send someone. You knew he'd send someone. I knew the letter from Oldtown wasn't only going to reach me, Jon said. He gestured to a chair near the table. Sit, you look like you've been riding in the cold. 3 days of it, Davos said, and sat down and was grateful. Jon looked at the wildling captains. Give us a moment, he said, and they filtered out with the unhurried ease of people who trusted the man giving the order and therefore didn't feel the need to make a production of obeying it. The red-haired woman stayed. Jon didn't send her away. Stannis sent you something, Davos said. He reached inside his coat and produced the letter. He also produced the original, Sam's letter, and set both on the table. His Grace knows you've already received a copy of the Tarly letter. He thought you should have the original. Jon looked at both letters on the table for a moment. He picked up Sam's letter first and turned it over in his hands, not reading it. He had read it, Davos guessed, many more times than was strictly necessary, just holding it. Then he picked up Stannis' letter and read it and set it down. He wants to talk, Jon said. He does, and he's not here himself. He thought you might find it easier to hear his position from someone less. His Grace sometimes has a manner in conversation that can. Davos stopped and reconsidered. He wanted you to have time to think before you met. Something moved in Jon's face that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. That's diplomatic. I'm a diplomatic man. Davos paused. Lord Snow, he wants to be straight with you. He knows what this letter means for his claim. He's not pretending otherwise, and he's not planning to hide this or use it as a lever against you. He wanted you to know that. Jon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and in that moment Davos caught a glimpse of what the man must have been doing for the past week, sitting with the enormous quiet of a name that had just been attached to him, feeling the weight of it, deciding what to do. He wants an alliance, Jon said. He wants to win. Same thing, is it? Davos tilted his head. He wants the dead stop. He's always wanted that, even before Melisandre convinced him it was the Lord of Light's personal agenda. He's seen the whites, he knows what's beyond the wall, and he knows, he paused, he knows that 2 kings fighting each other is how you lose a war before it starts. Jon was quiet for a while. The red-haired woman, Davos didn't know her name, was watching Jon with an expression that was both proprietary and deeply invested. the expression of someone who has tied their own fate to another person's decisions and is now waiting to see if those decisions are good ones. The North will rally to Winterfell, Jon said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of something he had been working through. Not to a Targaryen name, not yet, maybe not ever, if we're being honest about how Northerners feel about dragons and Southern crowns. But Winterfell is different. Ned Stark's memory is different. He paused. I carry both names, he stopped. That's something Stannis doesn't have. He knows it. And Melisandre, Jon said. She told him she told him she was wrong, Davos said quietly. That landed. Jon looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise but was interested. The focused interest of a man filing away a piece of information that would need to be considered later. Good, Jon said. He said it simply without satisfaction, the way you'd say good about a problem that had resolved itself before you had to deal with it. Lord Snow, Davos leaned forward. I've served Stannis Baratheon for a long time. I know him better than almost anyone alive. He is a hard man. He is not always a kind man. But he is a just man, and he is a man who does not lie. And when he says he wants to speak to you as an equal about how to win the war that's coming, he held Jon's gaze. He means exactly that, not a power play, not a trap, just a man who understands that the dead don't care who sits on the throne, and that two of us standing together might just be enough. Jon looked at the letters on the table. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the red-haired woman, the wildling girl, Davos realized, the one who'd come through the wall with the baby, and something passed between them that wasn't words, just the shorthand of two people who'd been through difficult things together. When does Stannis want to meet? Jon said. North of Castle Black, in the frozen world beyond the edge of the map where ordinary problems stopped mattering, something was moving. The scouts who came back from ranging, the few who came back, reported the same thing in different words. Silence where there had been sound, stillness where there had been movement, cold that went beyond weather into something else entirely. One scout, a wildling woman named Munda who had ranged beyond the wall for 30 years and was afraid of almost nothing, came back from a 3-day ride and sat in the great hall and drank a full cup of wine before she spoke. They're moving, she said. Jon stood at the end of the table. How many? I don't know. She looked at her cup. Too many. They're moving south, all of them I think, all at once. She looked up at him. I've never seen them do that before, move all together. They move like, she stopped, like they're being directed, like there's something behind them pushing. The hall was very quiet. How long? Jon said. Weeks, maybe less. Jon looked at Davos, who was still in the hall, still in his traveling clothes, his cup of mulled wine halfway to his mouth and no longer moving. Davos looked back at him. I need to meet with Stannis, Jon said. Now, not in a week now. I'll ride back tonight, Davos said. You just got here, you just heard that the dead are marching. Davos put down his wine and stood up. I'll ride back tonight. Melisandre knew before Davos returned. She was in her tent with a brazier full of flames and her eyes open, seeing things in the fire that she had not let herself see clearly in too long, had been looking at them sideways, interpreting them through the lens of what she wanted to see rather than what was there. She had been doing that for years. She stopped doing it now. The flames showed her a man in the cold, dark-haired and gray-eyed, standing on a field of white with something burning in his hand. The burning was not fire, not exactly, it was light, the light that comes before fire, the light that fire aspires to. And behind him in the vision the sky was dark in a way that the sky only got in her worst visions, the absolute dark of the long night, the dark of a world where the sun had given up. But in front of him it was not dark, where he stood there was light. She sat with this for a long time, she thought about the errors she had made. The shadow baby she had made with Stannis, which had killed Renly Baratheon and accomplished nothing in the grand calculation of what mattered. The leech ceremony. The things she had done in the name of certainty she had not earned. She was not a woman given to guilt, but she was given to pragmatism, and the practical fact was that she had wasted considerable time and done considerable damage navigating by a flawed map. The map was being corrected now. She thought about the boy at the wall. She thought about his face when she had tried to tell him he was Azor Ahai and he had said don't. Not afraid, not angry, just setting a boundary with the complete confidence of a man who knew himself well enough to know when someone was trying to pour him into a shape he didn't fit. She thought about the night she had tried to seduce him, years ago, and he had said I'm still in mourning with such simple directness that she had stood there for a moment genuinely uncertain what to do next, which was a feeling she had not had in a very long time. She thought about what that quality, that capacity for simple, unadorned self-knowledge would mean in a king. She looked back into the fire. In the flames, the dark-haired man turned his face toward her, and the light in his hand grew brighter. She rose from her chair and went to find Stannis. He was in his tent as she had known he would be, bent over maps with the fierce concentration of a man who believed that sufficiently thorough planning could compensate for most of the problems the world chose to present. Davos will return by tomorrow, she said. I know, he's fast when he has reason to be. Snow is coming to meet you. Stannis looked up. You saw this, I know it. She sat across from him. She had already decided to say what she was about to say, and Melisandre, once decided on a course, did not circle it. Your Grace, I owe you an honest accounting. You've given me that, more of it. She looked at him steadily. You are a great man, Stannis Baratheon. I have said this before, and it was always true. A just man, a man of iron principles and genuine courage. The realm needs men like you. She paused. But the realm needs Aegon Targaryen on the throne, and I think you have always known that the throne was never truly the point. The war was the point. The long night was the point. Stannis was very still. He was looking at her with the expression of a man receiving information he had already worked out but not yet admitted. The living need a figurehead, she continued. Someone who means something to more people than you currently mean something to. Someone who carries a northern name and a southern bloodline, who can hold the realm together long enough to face what's coming. She held his gaze. You cannot be that person, not because of who you are, but because of what the realm is. People are irrational. History is irrational. Symbolism matters. I know, Stannis said. He said it quietly, without rancor. Just, I know, you could still have a role. I don't need you to find me a role, he said, not unkindly. I'm capable of identifying my own utility. He looked at the map, looked at the great sprawl of Westeros laid out in lines and shadings, the wall across the top of it like a scar. I want to win this war. I have always wanted to win this war. If Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, is the better candidate to lead it. He stopped, ground his teeth, stopped doing that. Then that is the conclusion I am forced to. You are forced to nothing, Melisandre said. You are choosing it. There is a difference. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Yes, he said at last, there is a difference. Something shifted in his face, not softened. Stannis did not soften, but recalibrated. As if certain internal machinery had been adjusted for a new purpose. Prepare for company. When Davos returns with Snow, I want a proper meeting. No games, no courtly maneuvering. He picked up his pen. Just two men figuring out how to keep the world alive. Melisandre rose to leave. Melisandre, she stopped. Your visions, Stannis said without looking up. They were never wrong about the dark. No, she said, never about that. Then we'd better make sure the light shows up on time. He went back to his maps. She went back to her fire. Outside the tent, the northern night pressed in from all sides, cold and absolute and full of something that was not quite waiting, because waiting implied patience, and what was gathering beyond the wall had nothing like patience in it. It simply came. It had always simply come. And somewhere between the wall and Winterfell, two men who between them carried the weight of the living world's last chance were riding toward each other through the snow, not yet knowing the full shape of what they were riding toward, but knowing, in the way that men who have been tested know things, in the bones and the blood rather than the mind, that whatever came next was going to require everything they had. Every last thing. Chapter 3. What the Fire remembers. The meeting happened in a farmhouse. Not a castle, not a tent, not any of the formal spaces that kings and their advisors preferred for the theater of diplomacy. Just a farmhouse 2 leagues south of Castle Black, abandoned when the farmer and his family had packed what they could carry and gone south ahead of the winter, leaving behind a stone hearth, a table that leaned slightly to the left, and 4 chairs that didn't match. Davos had picked it because it was equidistant between both camps and because it had a roof, and after 3 days of riding through northern snow, Davos had developed strong opinions about roofs. Jon arrived first. He came with Tormund and Ghost and nobody else, which was either a statement of confidence or a statement of indifference to the possibility of threat, and with Jon Snow, it was genuinely difficult to tell which. He tied his horse outside and pushed open the farmhouse door and looked at the empty room and then at Tormund. Good, he said, meaning we're first, and walked in and sat down in the chair closest to the hearth. Tormund took a position near the door, which was where Tormund preferred to be in any enclosed space, close to the exit, with a clear view of everything between him and it. He crossed his arms and looked at the farmhouse with the expression of a man who found the entire concept of meeting indoors to discuss important matters mildly absurd, but was willing to tolerate it. Ghost lay down in front of the hearth as if he owned it, which was fair enough, Jon thought. Ghost owned most spaces he walked into. Stannis arrived 20 minutes later with Davos and Melisandre. He came through the door and looked at Jon in the chair and looked at Ghost in front of the fire, and something moved briefly through his expression, not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of a man who had prepared himself for a range of situations and was now identifying which one he was in. He moved to the table and sat across from Jon without ceremony, and Davos sat beside him, and Melisandre took the fourth chair slightly apart from the table, as if she were there to observe rather than participate. They looked at each other across the leaning table. Jon studied the king. He had seen Stannis once before, briefly, at the wall, and the impression he had retained was of a man built entirely from right angles, jaw, shoulders, opinions, with eyes the color of deep water and the quality of someone who had been waiting his entire life for the world to start making sense and had more or less given up on it. He looked like a man who had lost a great deal and was carrying the loss not as grief but as a kind of permanent, productive fury. Stannis looked back at Jon with similar attention. "You're younger than I expected," Stannis said. "Not an insult, just an observation." "You're exactly what I expected," Jon said. Something shifted in Stannis' face that might in a different man have become a smile. It didn't quite get there. "I was told you don't waste time. Neither do you, from what I've heard. Then we'll skip the part where we establish credibility and get to the part that matters." Stannis placed his hands flat on the table, which appeared to be his version of settling in. "You've read Tarly's letter." "Yes, you've had time to think about what it means." "Some time, and," Stannis said. Jon looked at the fire. Ghost's tail moved once slowly and settled again. Outside the farmhouse the wind was working itself into something, not a storm yet but the suggestion of one, the low moaning sound of air finding gaps in stone walls. "And I think the letter is true," Jon said. "I think Aemon told Sam the truth and Sam told me the truth, and whatever I am because of that truth is a problem I'll deal with when I have to." He looked back at Stannis. "Right now the problem I have to deal with is about 12,000 whites and at least 3 white walkers moving south, and I have wildlings who fight and Night's Watch men who are still deciding if they believe it, and I have—" He stopped. "What do you have?" 8,000 men, Stannis said. "Battle-hardened, most of them, well-armed, hungry and cold, which is actually a useful combination in a fight." He paused. "Dragonglass, we have the caches from Dragonstone." "How much?" "Enough to arm a significant portion of both our forces." Jon looked at him. "You brought it north." "I did. When I first came to the wall, I anticipated this conversation happening eventually." Something in Stannis' face said that he had, in fact, anticipated it quite a long time ago and had found the wait irritating. "I am not a man who repeats preventable mistakes. The last time I came north without enough dragonglass I lost men I couldn't afford to lose." Jon nodded slowly. "I also have a sorceress," Stannis said with the tone of a man acknowledging a complicated asset, who appears to have revised her theology recently and is therefore potentially more reliable than she was previously. Melisandre, from her chair at the edge of the room, looked at Stannis with an expression that was entirely serene. "What do you want from me?" Jon said. Stannis regarded him for a moment. "The North," he said, "not as subjects, not as conquered territory, as allies. The Northern lords will ride for Winterfell, and they will ride for Ned Stark's blood, and they will not ride for me." He said this without bitterness, just the plain acknowledgement of a geographical and political reality. "You have that name, use it. And you want what in return? To be useful," Stannis said. "I am very good at being useful. I am considerably better at it than I am at being liked, which has always been my primary obstacle in politics." He leaned forward very slightly. "I want command of the campaign's military logistics. I want my 8,000 integrated with your forces on terms we agree to jointly. And I want—" a pause that Jon recognized as a man approaching something he found difficult to say. "I want your word that when this is done and the dead are beaten back, the question of governance will be settled by something other than whoever has the most swords at the time." Jon looked at him. "You want me to promise I won't just take the throne because I can," Jon said. "I want you to promise that the question gets answered properly. Council lords, something with a structure that isn't just the strongest man standing on a pile of corpses." Stannis' jaw tightened. "I have been the rightful king by every law and precedent that exists in this realm. I have watched that mean precisely nothing 3 times over because the man with the army made the decision." He met Jon's eyes directly. "I am not asking for the throne, I am asking for the principle." Jon was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he was being asked, stripped down past all the political language. A man who had wanted a crown his entire life was sitting across a table telling Jon that he would set that one aside for something he believed in more. That, Jon thought, was either the most principled thing he had ever seen or the most sophisticated power play. With Stannis Baratheon, it seemed genuinely possible it was both simultaneously. "You have my word," Jon said. Stannis nodded once. "Deal made." "Right," Jon said, and stood up and turned to the map he had brought and spread it across the leaning table. "Let's talk about the dead." They talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, the table was covered in Jon's marks and Stannis's corrections and Davos's occasional annotations, which were always practical and usually made both of them slightly annoyed because they were right. Melisandre said almost nothing until the very end, and what she said then was about the Night King, not his tactics or his numbers but his nature, the deep cold theology of what he was and what he wanted, which was not conquest or resources or territory in any way a living mind could fully encompass. He wants silence, she said. He wants the world to end its noise. Every fire, every heartbeat, every breath, he wants it stopped. Useful to know, Stannis said, in the tone he used when something disturbed him and he was refusing to let it show. It means he won't negotiate, Jon said. It means there's no leverage, no terms, no political solution. He looked at the map. It means every man and woman alive needs to fight, because losing isn't losing territory or losing power. Losing is just ending. Nobody argued with that. When they left the farmhouse, snow was falling in earnest, thick and dense and straight down, the kind of snow that meant serious winter had made its final decision and was committing. Jon stood by his horse and looked at Stannis, who was pulling on his gloves with the focused efficiency of a man who considered the cold a personal opponent that he would not give the satisfaction of an outward reaction. Winterfell, Jon said, we consolidate there. Bring your men south and west, we'll meet you in a week. I'll be there in 5 days, Stannis said. I said a week. I said 5 days. He mounted his horse. Try to keep up. He rode south without another word. Davos followed, with one backward glance at Jon that contained, in its brief duration, the compressed expression of a man who had spent years managing Stannis Baratheon and was resigned to continuing to do so. Jon watched them go. Tormund appeared at his shoulder. I like him, he said. You like everyone who argues with me. I like people who mean what they say. Tormund squinted into the falling snow. He means what he says. Yes, Jon agreed. He does. He mounted his own horse. Come on, we have letters to write. The letters went out from Castle Black over the next 2 days, carried by riders and ravens to every northern house with men to spare and a grudge to settle, which was most of them. Jon wrote each one himself. He did not use a maester's formal language or the elaborate courtesies of southern correspondence. He wrote the way he spoke, direct and plain and without embellishment, and he signed each one Jon Snow, Winterfell without the title and without the Targaryen name, because Sansa had always been the one who understood northern politics, and Sansa wasn't here yet. But she was coming. He knew she was coming the way he sometimes knew things, not from information but from the shape of events, the way certain stories had a gravity to them that pulled everything toward the same place. Sansa was clever, and she had survived things that would have destroyed most people, and she was moving pieces on a board that Jon hadn't even seen yet. He had learned to trust that about her in the abstract, the way you trust a navigator on a ship you can't see. The letter she sent arrived on the 3rd day. It was brief, written in Sansa's precise, careful hand, and it said, I'm coming with an army. Don't do anything irreversible before I get there. S. Jon read it twice and gave it to Tormund, who studied it with the seriousness he brought to all written documents, which was complicated by the fact that he couldn't read. What does it say? It says my sister is coming. Good sister or bad sister? The complicated kind. Jon took the letter back. The best kind. She arrived at Winterfell 3 days before Stannis, which was either luck or planning, and with Sansa it was always planning. She came through the gates with Littlefinger's Vale Knights arranged behind her in their sky-blue armor, 600 of them, and Sansa herself on a gray mare with her auburn hair loose and snowflakes settling in it like decoration, wearing a gray cloak that was simultaneously practical and composed, the way everything about Sansa was simultaneously practical and composed. Jon met her in the courtyard. They looked at each other for a moment, and then she was off her horse and he was moving toward her, and they held each other in the middle of Winterfell's courtyard, with neither of them saying anything, because some things sit below language, in the place where words are irrelevant. You came back, he said into her hair. I told you I would, she said. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were blue and sharp and taking in everything about him the way she always had, reading the changes, cataloging what the time had done. She seemed to find something that satisfied her, though she didn't say what. You're different. I died. That would do it. She released him and straightened her cloak with the brisk, composed manner of someone returning to business. I heard about Bowen Marsh. I heard you hanged them. I did. Good, said simply without drama. Then we need to talk about the letter. I know, privately. I know, Sansa. She looked at him steadily. Jon, do you understand what the letter means? Not just for you, for all of this. I'm working on understanding it. Work faster. She glanced at Littlefinger, who had dismounted 10 feet away and was standing with his hands folded, watching the reunion with the expression he always wore, pleasantly attentive, apparently harmless, giving nothing away. Some people already know, word travels faster than letters. Jon followed her gaze to Littlefinger. He looked at the man and the man looked back at him, and Jon had the clear and simple feeling that he was looking at a problem that needed solving, and that letting Sansa solve it in her own way would probably be more effective than anything he might do directly. "Let's go inside," Jon said. They sat in the solar that had been Ned Stark's and then Robb's and then, for a grim period, Roose Bolton's. Sansa had already begun the quiet work of reclaiming it, small things, a particular arrangement of the furniture, the fire built the way she remembered their father building it, a gray direwolf banner replacing what had been there before. It was still a room that remembered what had happened in it, but it was being reminded of older memories. Sansa poured wine for both of them, sat across from Jon, and placed Sam's letter on the table between them. She had her own copy. Jon didn't ask how she'd gotten it, because with Sansa you either followed the information trail or you trusted the conclusions, and Jon had learned which approach was faster. "The North will follow you to Winterfell," she said. Stark name, Stark face, Ned's son, or who they believed was Ned's son, which amounts to the same thing. But if the Targaryen name becomes public knowledge, she paused, choosing words with the care of a woman who has learned what careless words cost. Some lords will see an opportunity, some will see a threat, and Littlefinger, she glanced at the closed door. Littlefinger will see a lever, he sees everything as a lever. "What do you want to do about him?" Sansa looked at her wine. "He thinks he's managing me," she said quietly. "He's been thinking that since the Eyrie. He brought the Vale Knights here because he believes it gives him influence over me and through me over whatever comes next." She looked up. "Let him think that a little longer." Jon looked at her. She had changed, not in ways he could easily describe, but in ways that were visible in her posture, in the directness she used to lack, in the way she made decisions with the settled confidence of someone who had made terrible decisions and survived them and learned the difference. She was 22 years old and she had seen more politics than most lords saw in a lifetime. "You know about the Targaryen name," Jon said. "You've had time to think about it. What do you actually think?" She looked at him with the particular steadiness that was her version of taking something seriously. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are still my brother, whatever your name is." She paused. "I also think that in the Game of Thrones, a legitimate Targaryen heir who is also Ned Stark's nephew, who has fought beyond the wall and led the Night's Watch and who the wildlings follow." She stopped. "Jon, I grew up on songs about Aegon the Conqueror. I know what that name means to people, and I know what your name means to the North." She held his gaze. "Together those things are—" "Don't," Jon said. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me what I should want to be," he said, not angry, just clear. "I'll figure out what I am. I'm already working on it." He looked at the letter on the table. "I made Stannis a promise." She raised an eyebrow. "Not the throne," he said. "That when this is done, governance gets settled properly. Council, representation, something that isn't just the strongest man." Sansa looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read everything in her expression, but he could read enough to know that she was surprised and that the surprise was a good kind. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've had a very boring week with nothing to do but plan a war and contemplate my entire identity." She almost smiled. It was the most Sansa smile possible, small and controlled and with something warmer behind it than she allowed the surface to show. "That's actually," she stopped, "that's actually the right thing to promise. I know. I just want to make sure you understand what you're stepping into when Daenerys Targaryen arrives with 3 dragons." Jon went still. "She's crossed the Narrow Sea," Sansa said. "My sources say she landed at Dragonstone a fortnight ago. She has the Dothraki and the Unsullied and the dragons." She picked up her wine. "And she has no idea there is another Targaryen in Westeros." Jon absorbed this. "She's going to find out," Sansa said. "And when she does, she will either see you as an ally or an enemy, and which one it is will depend entirely on how she learns about it and from whom." She set down her wine. "This needs to be managed." "I'm not going to hide what I am," Jon said. "I'm not asking you to," Sansa met his eyes. "I'm asking you to control the moment of revelation. There's a difference between hiding a thing and choosing when to show it." She paused. "She's a queen with a claim. She sacrificed enormously to get here. If she lands and finds out there's a rival claimant in the North, she will feel threatened, and a threatened queen with 3 dragons is— I understand the problem. Do you understand the solution?" Jon thought about it. "Meet her first," he said. "On honest terms, before she hears it from someone who wants it to be a crisis. Make her understand that I'm not competing with her for a throne I don't want. And if she doesn't believe you, then I'll convince her." "Jon, Sansa," he said it quietly, but there was something in his voice that was new or newly audible, the quality she had been reading in his face since she arrived. Not arrogance, something older than arrogance, a settled certainty. "I died, I came back, I have a name I didn't choose, and a war I didn't start, and a world that is deciding to end on my watch." He looked at her steadily. "I am done being careful about what I am. I'll meet Daenerys Targaryen and I'll tell her the truth and we'll figure out together what it means. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said, all right. All right, she picked up Sam's letter and folded it precisely and slid it across the table to him. But I'm writing the letter of introduction. You just say hello, I'm apparently your nephew, please don't burn me. Jon took the letter. That was not what I was going to say. It was very close to what you were going to say. He couldn't argue with that. Littlefinger came to Jon that evening. He came without announcement, which was how Littlefinger preferred to move, appearing in doorways as if he had materialized from the shadows rather than walked through them. He found Jon in the Great Hall reviewing supply counts with two of Stannis' advance riders who had arrived ahead of the main force, and he waited with tremendous patience near the door until Jon had finished and the riders had gone. Then he walked in. He was a small man, Petyr Baelish, smaller than Jon remembered, or perhaps Jon had grown into a different sense of scale. He moved with the careful precision of someone who controlled distance deliberately, never too close, never quite where you expected him to be. He had the face of a man who found everything mildly amusing, which was one of the most dangerous faces you could wear because it made you impossible to read. Lord Snow, he said pleasantly. Lord Baelish, Jon said. He didn't sit down and he didn't invite Littlefinger to sit. He stood at the table and looked at the man and waited. Littlefinger smiled. It was a real smile, which was somehow worse than a false one. I wanted to offer my congratulations on your return to Winterfell. It suits you. Thank you for the Vale Knights, Jon said. They were useful. Sansa tells me you were responsible. Sansa is generous. He tilted his head slightly. I wanted also to offer my counsel, if you'd find it useful, on the question of a brief pause that was both perfectly natural and perfectly calculated. The question of your parentage. Word has a way of spreading, Lord Snow, faster than ravens sometimes. I'm aware. Certain parties, if they heard before you'd had a chance to, Lord Baelish. Jon's voice was even unhurried. I appreciate the visit. I know what you're doing, which is telling me you know things and offering to help me manage them, and I want you to know that I've taken note of it. He met the man's eyes. The pleasant smile didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. I'm not going to manage this. I'm going to handle it directly. Whatever you know, whoever you've told it to, whatever you're planning, I want you to understand that I am not a man who can be positioned. Littlefinger looked at him. The smile remained. The eyes, however, were doing something different, recalibrating, Jon thought, the way you recalibrate an assessment when new data comes in. You're very like your father, Littlefinger said. Ned, I know who you mean. Jon held his gaze. And I know what happened to my father when he was honest in a city full of people who weren't. He paused. I'm not in King's Landing. The people around me tend to die honorably rather than politically. Another pause. Keep that in mind. It was not a threat, not exactly. It was just the truth presented plainly, which was something Littlefinger was clearly not accustomed to, because for a brief moment, genuinely brief, a flicker, something moved in his face that was not the pleasant smile and not the calculating assessment, but something rawer than either. Then it was gone. Of course, Lord Snow, he said pleasantly. I'm sure we understand each other. I'm sure we do, Jon said. Littlefinger left. Jon stood at the table and breathed slowly and thought about what had just happened. He thought about Ned, who had done almost exactly what Jon had just done, been plain and honest with a dangerous man in a castle, and about how that had ended. The difference, Jon thought, was that Ned had been in someone else's castle. This was Winterfell. Stannis arrived on the 4th day, which was a day before he'd promised, and Davos had the look of a man who was too tired to be surprised by anything his king did anymore. The arrival had weight to it, 8,000 men moving through Winterfell's gates in organized columns, equipped and disciplined in a way that Jon's forces, still largely composed of wildlings who treated formations as a vague suggestion, were not. Stannis rode at the head of them with his back perfectly straight and his face set in its habitual expression of engaged austerity, and he looked at Winterfell with the eyes of a man assessing a military position, and then he looked at Jon, who was waiting in the yard, and gave a single nod. Jon nodded back, no ceremony, no speeches, two men who had made a deal recognizing each other across a courtyard. You're early, Jon said. I said 5 days, Stannis said, dismounting. It's been 4. 4.5, he pulled off his gloves. The roads were better than I expected. Liar, Davos said under his breath from a safe distance. Jon showed Stannis to the solar. Sansa was there with maps already spread and a fire already burning, which was Sansa's way of saying I knew you were coming and I've been ready for an hour. Stannis looked at her with the assessment he gave everyone, the rapid analytical inventory, and then he looked at Jon and something in his expression said, She's better at this than you are, not as an insult, just as a fact. Lady Sansa, Stannis said. Your Grace, Sansa said. Sit down, we have a great deal to discuss. He sat. Melisandre came in behind him and stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, at Jon, at Sansa, at the maps and the fire and the specific arrangement of people and power in the space, and she stood very still for a moment with an expression that was not quite reverence and not quite wonder but sat close to both. She had been in this room before in the flames. She was almost certain of it. "Shall we begin?" she said. They planned for 3 days. Not the battle itself, the battle was still weeks away. Its shape not yet fixed, its location a question of what the dead chose to do, and where the living could put themselves in a position to survive. What they planned was everything around the battle: supply lines and evacuation routes, the positioning of dragonglass weapons, the message to send to lords who were still sitting in their halls deciding which way the wind was blowing. On the second day of planning, a raven arrived from Bear Island. Lady Lyanna Mormont, 10 years old and already twice as decisive as most grown men, wrote in a hand so direct it was almost violent. House Mormont remembers, the North remembers. "We will send 62 men, each worth 10 mainlanders. Send word when the Wildfire King is ready and we will march." She had apparently heard about Jon. She had apparently decided. Jon read the letter aloud and the room went quiet for a moment, and then Tormund, who had been sitting in the corner being largely ignored by the planners, said, "I like her." "You've never met her," Jon said. "I like the idea of her." On the third day, Sansa told Jon privately that 2 more ravens had come from lords she had been cultivating since before she arrived, Glover and Serwyn, both cautious men who had been waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before committing. They were committing. "The North was waking up. It's you," she said. "Not the name, well, not just the name. It's that you came back and you didn't hide and you didn't negotiate your own survival. You just kept doing what needed doing." She paused. "People follow that. People followed Robb," Jon said. "Look where that ended." "Robb was 17, Sansa said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had thought about this a great deal. "You're not 17. Jon looked out the solar window at Winterfell's yard below, at Stannis's men training alongside wildlings in the gray morning light, the strange sight of black brothers and free folk and knights from the Vale moving through drills together with the awkward inevitability of things that have to work and are therefore working. Ghost moved through them like a pale ghost of something, and people parted around him without fear, just awareness. "No," Jon said, "I'm not." He watched the yard. Below, a wildling woman and a knight from the Vale were arguing about grip technique on a dragonglass blade, loudly and with gestures in 2 different languages. Neither of them understood the other. Somehow they were both learning anyway. "We're going to need the dragons," Jon said. Sansa was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "When I meet Daenerys, I've drafted the letter," she said. "I told you I would." She produced it from inside her sleeve, which meant she'd had it ready since yesterday. Jon took it and read it and looked up. "You told her I'm her nephew," he said. "Better she hears it from us than from Cersei's spies. You signed it from both of us." "Was that wrong?" Jon looked at the letter. At his name, Jon Snow, next to hers, the 2 of them making a joint declaration to a queen across the water. He thought about the name below it that he hadn't written yet, wasn't ready to write, might never be ready to write. "No," he said, "that was right." He folded the letter. "Send it." She took it back, already moving toward the door, already 3 steps ahead. She stopped in the doorway and turned, and for a moment she looked less like the composed political operator she had become and more like the girl he remembered from Winterfell, the girl who had believed in songs and princes and the goodness of distant places before the world had explained itself to her. "Jon," she said, "for what it's worth." She paused. "Father would be proud." He didn't answer because there was nothing to say to that. It hit him somewhere below words, in the place where grief and love and the specific weight of who Ned Stark had been all lived together. She left. He stood at the window and watched the yard. Below, the wildling woman and the Vale Knight had apparently resolved their argument and were now practicing together with a concentrated mutual respect that was better than most things Jon had seen all week. Ghost sat at the edge of the yard and watched them, and his red eyes caught the gray morning light and held it. Somewhere to the south, a letter was being sealed and given to a raven that would fly across water toward a queen with dragons who didn't know what was waiting for her. Somewhere to the north, 12,000 dead things were moving through the cold. And in the Winterfell solar, a fire burned in the same hearth where Ned Stark had once built fires for his children, and the light it threw was warm and steady and very, very determined. Chapter 4, Blood and Stone. Cersei Lannister received the news on a Wednesday, which she would later remember only because she had been in the middle of a meeting about wine tariffs, which was the sort of meeting that happened when you were queen, and the kingdom needed managing, and nobody else could be trusted to do it correctly. Qyburn came in without knocking. She had given him permission to do that, to enter without knocking, to interrupt without apology, whenever the information was worth the interruption. It was a permission she had extended to precisely 2 people in her lifetime, and the first one was dead. Qyburn understood the privilege and did not abuse it, which meant that when he walked in on her wine tariff meeting with that particular quality of stillness that meant something significant had happened, she felt the shift in the room's atmosphere before he said a word. "Leave us," she said to the 3 lords still mid-sentence about shipping routes. They left. Qyburn crossed the room and placed a folded piece of parchment on the table in front of her. His hands were steady, which was more than could be said for the man who had brought it to him, apparently. She picked it up and read it. It was brief, 2 sources, cross-referenced, the kind of intelligence she trusted more than elaborate reports precisely because brevity meant confidence. 1 line from a contact near White Harbor. 1 line from a raven intercepted near Moat Cailin. Both of them saying the same thing in different words. Jon Snow lives, real name Aegon Targaryen, legitimate heir, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. Stannis Baratheon has allied with him. Northern lords are rallying. Winterfell is operational. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the window, the view from the Red Keep across King's Landing, the city spread below like a map of itself, the harbor glittering in the distance, the sept of Baelor's dome catching the afternoon light. She had sat in this room and looked at that view through enough crises to have developed a particular relationship with it. The view didn't change. It was steadying in its way. The city went on regardless. How reliable, she said. Very, Qyburn said. I would not have brought it otherwise. Rhaegar's son, she said it slowly, testing the words. Lyanna Stark's boy. Living behind the wall for 20 years as a bastard. She was quiet for a moment. Robert would have laughed himself sick, no doubt, and then he would have sent an assassin. She picked up her wine. Robert was practical about Targaryens. She drank, set the cup down. How many people know? Difficult to say with precision. The letter originated with a Maester who died on a ship from Old Town. The information was contained for perhaps 2 weeks before it began to spread. Now, Qyburn considered, now it is the kind of secret that has escaped the people who were keeping it. It exists independently, meaning anyone could know. Meaning enough people know that suppressing it is no longer an option worth pursuing. He paused. The question is narrative control. Cersei looked at him. This was why she valued him, not the bodies in the basement, not the little birds, not the particular inventiveness he brought to problems that required inventiveness. It was this, the capacity to identify the actual question embedded in a situation, stripped of emotion, stripped of the story she might tell herself about it. He's in the north, she said. He has Stannis, who has 8,000 soldiers. He has wildlings, who are animals but are also soldiers. He has the north rallying to him, and the north can field. She stopped calculating and looked at the window again. He has Sansa Stark, yes, who has the veil, yes, who is substantially cleverer than her brother. By most accounts, Qyburn said, with the diplomatic neutrality of a man whose assessment agreed, but who understood that comparative statements about the intelligence of potential enemies were not useful in strategy sessions. Cersei was quiet for a moment. She thought about Sansa Stark, whom she had dressed and shaped and observed for the better part of 2 years in King's Landing, thinking she was shaping a tool and discovering too late that she had been watching someone learn. Sansa had sat in the Red Keep with those blue eyes taking everything in, and Cersei had thought, this girl is moldable, biddable, nothing. And she had been wrong, which was a category of error that Cersei found genuinely difficult to metabolize. The Targaryen girl is at Dragonstone, Cersei said. Yes, with 3 dragons, yes, and she doesn't know about Jon Snow yet. Our intelligence suggests the information is traveling toward her. A raven from Winterfell, by our best estimate. Cersei turned this in her mind like a stone in a hand, feeling the edges. 2 Targaryens, 2 claimants, one with dragons, one with the north. The natural response to 2 claimants competing for the same throne was to let them compete, to stand back and allow the collision to do damage to both sides. That was the clever play, the play she would have made 5 years ago without hesitation. The problem was the dead. She had received reports about the dead the same way she received reports about most northern problems, with a mixture of skepticism and contempt, because northerners had always had a flair for drama and a tendency to use supernatural language to describe things that were just, at bottom, practical problems with practical solutions. Wildlings were barbarians. Winter was weather. The Night's Watch were dramatic old men in cloaks. But the reports had been coming with increasing frequency and from increasingly diverse sources, and the thing about Qyburn was that he did not let her dismiss information just because it was uncomfortable. If it's real, she said, the dead. If they actually come south. If they do, Qyburn said, then King's Landing has a wall 20 feet high and an inexhaustible supply of people who will panic and create more problems than they solve. Helpful, you asked. She stood up and moved to the window. Below, King's Landing went on, merchants and small folk and the endless noise of a city that had no idea what was being discussed 200 feet above its head. She thought about Joffrey. She thought about Tommen. She thought about Miachella, who was gone before she'd had a chance to become anything except a kind girl in a world that ate kind things. She thought about James somewhere in the Riverlands, doing things she had asked him to do and probably also things she hadn't. She thought about what she was willing to do. The answer, when she found it, was the same answer it had always been: anything. She was willing to do anything because the alternative was losing, and losing meant her children died for nothing and the Lannister name died with them, and she had given too much for that. Every piece of herself that she had sacrificed to the game, her marriage, her dignity, her humanity in the places where she had let it slip, all of it only mattered if it purchased something. If she won. "I need Euron Greyjoy," she said. Qyburn looked at her. "He has ships," she said. "More ships than anyone still breathing, and he has." She paused. "He wants to give me dragons. He thinks he can bind the Targaryen girls' dragons." She turned from the window. "He's probably wrong, but if he can disrupt her, if he can engage her fleet, damage her supply lines, create enough chaos that the two Targaryens can't unite cleanly." "You buy time," Qyburn said. "I buy time." She came back to the table. "And while they're occupied with each other and the dead in the seven hells of the north, I consolidate the south. I fill the city with gold and grain and soldiers. I make King's Landing impregnable." She picked up the intelligence report and folded it. "And when whatever survives comes south, they'll find that the south has made its own arrangements. And if nothing survives," Qyburn said carefully, "then I'm the only queen left standing," Cersei said, "which has always been the goal." Qyburn looked at her for a moment. Not judging, Qyburn had moved past the capacity for moral judgment the same way other men aged past certain physical abilities, with a kind of relieved practicality. He was simply assessing. "Send for Euron," he said. "Send for Euron," she agreed. Euron Greyjoy arrived in King's Landing 4 days later on a ship that he had named Silence, and which was everything its name implied, crewed by mutes, running without the normal sounds of a vessel in port, slipping into the harbor with the quiet purposefulness of a blade going into a gap in armor. He was a large man, broader than he looked in descriptions, with an eye patch over his left eye, and his remaining eye the particular blue-gray of deep cold water. He dressed like a king who had decided that conventional kingship was insufficiently theatrical, and had compensated accordingly: black coat, silver fittings, the Kraken's sigil at his throat. He looked at everything he encountered as if he were already calculating what use it might be to him. He looked at Cersei the same way. She found this, against her better judgment, interesting. They met in the throne room, which she had chosen deliberately, not the small council chamber, not a private solar, but the full theater of the Iron Throne's hall with its 1,000 swords and its cold stone light. She sat in the throne itself, which she had begun doing with increasing regularity because the throne was hers, and she intended to behave accordingly. And she watched Euron Greyjoy walk the length of the hall toward her with the gait of a man who had never in his life modified his walk for anyone. "Your Grace," he said. He had a voice that carried, deep and unhurried, with the slightly elevated quality of a man who was always performing, but performing for himself rather than for an audience. "You're more beautiful than the songs say." "The songs are poorly written," Cersei said. "Sit down." He sat on the steps below the throne, which was technically improper and also, she noticed, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire hall and both exits. Sailor's instinct. "You said you could give me a gift," she said. "Dragons." "I said I could give you the Dragon Queen," he said. "The dragons are attached. She's at Dragonstone, for now." He tilted his head. "She's going to move soon. She has to. Sitting at Dragonstone is a symbolic position, not a winning one. When she moves, she'll have to bring her fleet." He smiled slowly. "And when she brings her fleet, you'll meet it." "I'll destroy it." He said it with the complete confidence of a man describing something he has done many times rather than something he intends to do once. "I built the greatest fleet in the world for this exact purpose. Iron Island's ships, Cersei, crewed by men who don't fear dying because they believe they're going to the drowned god's hall, fighting a Dothraki-coloned unsullied infantry at sea." He paused. "Those are land armies. They don't know the sea." "But she has dragons," Cersei said. "She has 3 dragons," he agreed. "Large ones, but dragons, for all their power, cannot be everywhere at once, and a fleet fight is chaos, and in chaos," he spread his hands. "In chaos, accidents happen." Cersei looked at him. He was either the most brilliant tactical mind she had encountered in years or a man whose confidence had far outrun his competence, and in her experience the difference between those two things was usually only visible after the fact. "What do you want?" she said. "You," he said, simply. She looked at him. He looked back with the one eye and the particular quality of a man who has decided he wants something and has arranged his life to acquire it. A queen needs a king. I have ships and soldiers and the will to use them. You have a throne and a kingdom and the intelligence to keep it. He paused. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to recognize a useful arrangement when you see one. Cersei considered this for a moment. She thought about Euron Greyjoy with the same analytical process she applied to everything: assets, liabilities, contingencies. He was violent and unpredictable and probably dangerous in ways that weren't fully apparent from one conversation. He was also possibly the one person in the world who could damage Daenerys Targaryen's fleet before she could establish herself on the mainland. She thought about the report sitting in Qyburn's chamber, the Targaryen heir in the north, Stannis Baratheon's army, the dead coming south. I'll consider it, she said. Consider it quickly, Euron said, standing. The Dragon Queen won't stay at Dragonstone forever. He looked up at her in the throne. Something moved in his single eye that was not respect exactly, but was its nearest functional equivalent. You're very good at this, you know, the game. I know, Cersei said. Pity the game's changing underneath you. He left. She sat in the Iron Throne and thought about that. Pity the game's changing underneath you. She hated that he was right. The Raven Sansa had found Daenerys Targaryen at Dragonstone on a gray morning when the sea was the color of old steel, and the three dragons were flying circuits above the castle in the particular way they had when they were restless, great dark shapes against the cloud. Daenerys was in the map room when Tyrion brought it to her. She had been spending significant time in the map room, as she had been spending significant time doing everything, with intense, contained focus, the focus of a woman who had crossed an ocean and was now standing at the edge of everything she had worked toward and was making absolutely certain she didn't do anything that couldn't be undone. Tyrion placed the letter on the table. You should read this, he said. His voice had the quality it got when he'd already read whatever it was and was managing his own reaction while presenting it to her. She read it standing up, and she stayed standing when she finished, but it required somewhat more effort than it had at the beginning. Sansa Stark's handwriting, Jon Snow's name alongside it, and between them, laid out with the careful precision of people who had decided not to soft-pedal a significant revelation. The truth of what Maester Aemon had said on a ship near Oldtown, the truth of what Ned Stark had carried his whole life, the truth of what Rhaegar and Lyanna had been to each other. She read the words Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, true-born and legitimate, and felt them hit her in the place where she had carried her identity like armor for 23 years. Is it true? She said. I believe so, Tyrion said. Maester Aemon was. I know who Aemon was. She set the letter down. My great-great-uncle. He served on the wall for 60 years rather than press his claim. She was quiet for a moment. Rhaegar. She said her brother's name the way she always said it, not from memory, because she had no memory of him, but from the weight of who she had been told he was. They say he was a good man. By all accounts, Tyrion said carefully, better than most in your family's recent history, which admittedly is a low bar. She looked at the letter. His claim is better than mine, she said. Just the plain fact of it, stated without drama, because she had learned a long time ago that plain facts stated plainly were less dangerous than plain facts avoided. Technically. Don't say technically, I know the inheritance law. She moved to the window. Below the castle, the sea was moving steadily against the rocks with the patience of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time. A legitimate son of Rhaegar's outranks a daughter of Aerys. The law is clear. She paused. Does he want the throne? The letter suggests not. The letter is written by his sister, who is clearly the political mind in that family and who would understand exactly how to phrase things to make him seem unthreatening. She turned from the window. I'm not criticizing, it's well written. If I were in her position, I would have written the same thing. She looked at Tyrion. What do you think? Tyrion was quiet for a moment, which meant he had opinions he was organizing rather than opinions he lacked. I think, he said eventually, that a man who spent years as a bastard and then Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and then died and came back to life and did not, upon returning, immediately set about claiming what was apparently his birthright. He paused. That is not the behavior of a man who wants a throne. No, Daenerys said, it's the behavior of a man with other priorities. The dead. She picked up the letter again. He speaks of the dead, the White Walkers. Which is, Tyrion stopped. There is mounting evidence that this is a genuine threat rather than northern legend. I know. She had been receiving reports. She had been listening to reports since she landed, and the reports about the dead were not coming from superstitious peasants. They were coming from people who had seen, from scouts and rangers and sailors who had no reason to embellish in the direction of existential horror. I've been planning to go north eventually. I'd always. She stopped. This changes the timeline. It might change more than the timeline. She looked at him. You went to Slaver's Bay and freed 300,000 people, Tyrion said. Because it was strategically optimal, not because it helped your claim, because it was right. He met her eyes. Jon Snow, from everything in this letter and everything I've heard of him, is a man who does things because they're right. He paused. That's either the beginning of an alliance or the beginning of a competition, and which one it is depends entirely on what happens when you meet. She was quiet for a long time. Right back, she said. Tell them I'm coming to Winterfell. She set the letter down. And tell them, she stopped. She thought about what to tell them, about how to say the thing she had been formulating since she first read the letter, the thing that was true and that she wanted him to know was true before they stood in the same room. Tell him I have no interest in a throne that requires me to take it from family. She paused. Tell him I want to meet him, just that. Tyrion looked at her with the expression he wore when she surprised him, which was an expression he wore rather more often than he probably preferred. That's send it, she said. She looked out at the dragons circling in the gray sky. Rhaegar's son, her nephew, if the letter was true. Her family, if the word still meant anything in the wreckage of the Targaryen name. She thought about the stories she'd been told about her family, the madness, the fires, the particular horror of what her father had become, and she thought about what it meant that Rhaegar had apparently been something different, that he had loved someone, that he had made something, that something was still alive behind a wall, carrying a name that wasn't his. She put her hand flat on the map of Westeros on the table. The map showed the whole kingdom, the south she had come to take, the north she had not yet reached, the wall across the top of it like a drawn line between the world of ordinary stakes and the world of absolute ones. Above the wall on the map there was nothing, just blank parchment where the cartographer had run out of known world. She looked at the blank space for a long time. Tyrion, she said, yes. If we lose in the north, she didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was too large for the map room. Then the south doesn't matter, Tyrion said quietly. Then the south doesn't matter, she agreed. She straightened up from the map. Get the ships ready, she said. We sail in 3 days. In Winterfell, Jon did not know that the letter had arrived. He was in the training yard at mid-morning doing what he did when he needed to think, which was move. He had always thought better in motion, always found that the body working cleared something in his mind that sitting could not. He was using a practice sword against a post, not sparring, just the repetitive mechanics of it. Cut, recover, footwork, cut again. The rhythmic work of muscle memory. Stannis found him there. The king watched from the edge of the yard for a moment without speaking, which was the most courteous thing Stannis Baratheon regularly did. He allowed people their activity before interrupting it. Jon brought the practice session to a natural stopping point and turned. News, Jon said, from our scouts beyond the wall. Stannis' voice was level, but level in the way of a man applying effort to keeping it so. They've crossed Eastwatch. Jon went still. The dead, Stannis said. They've come through Eastwatch by the sea. The garrison there, he stopped. There is no garrison there anymore. Jon said nothing. They're moving faster than the scouts' previous estimates, Stannis continued. We have perhaps 2 weeks, possibly less if they don't stop at night. He paused. They don't stop at night. Jon looked at the practice sword in his hand. He set it down carefully against the post. How many made it out of Eastwatch? 6 out of 40. 6 out of 40. Jon thought about the men who had stood that post, not names he knew well, not friends, but men who had pledged themselves to the wall and died for it in the way that the wall consumed men, quickly, without enough warning in the cold. We're not ready, Jon said. No, Stannis agreed. But we will be less ready in 2 weeks if we spend those 2 weeks pretending we have more time than we do. Jon looked across the yard. Through the gate he could see the practice going on, Stannis' men and wildlings drilling together, the dragonglass weapons being distributed, Tormund moving through the formations with the particular brand of chaos he brought to any organizational effort, which was paradoxically effective because it was genuine. People trusted Tormund's chaos. It felt like honesty. Daenerys, Jon said, her fleet won't be here in 2 weeks, Stannis said. I know, Jon thought. He thought about the shape of what was coming, the dead from the north, Cersei in the south, Daenerys crossing water that was shrinking by the hour. He thought about Winterfell, which was a castle that had survived a great deal and looked like a place where final stands were meant to happen, with its stone walls and its crypts and its fires that had been burning for thousands of years. He thought about the dragonglass. We move the civilians south of the neck, he said. Everyone who can't fight. Women, children, old men, we get them south and we do it now, before the road's close. He looked at Stannis. Can your men manage the movement? Yes. Good. Tormund's people, the wildlings, they fight, every one of them. No exceptions, no special cases. They've been fighting these things longer than any of us have, and they're the ones who understand them. He paused. I need dragonglass to every fighter who doesn't already have it today. I need the walls manned fully. I need fire at every gate. Jon. Stannis said his name in a way that was not quite gentle, because gentleness was not available in Stannis' register, but was something adjacent to it. I know the list, we know the list, I'm not here for the list. Jon stopped. Stannis looked at him with the directness that was, Jon had decided, the thing he most respected about the man. No performance, no political calculation, just a person who had thought something through and was now saying it. When this begins, Stannis said, the living will need to see something worth fighting for, not just a plan, not just a strategy. Something, he paused, and it was the pause of a man choosing a word that didn't come easily to him. Something symbolic. He looked at Jon. You know what I mean. Jon looked at him. The name, Jon said. The name, Stannis confirmed. Not because names win battles, because people fight differently when they know what they're fighting for. He held Jon's gaze. You asked me to accept that the question of governance gets settled properly afterward. I accepted that because I believe you. I'm asking you to accept that some things need to be said before the battle, not after, because afterward there may not be an afterward. The yard was noisy around them, training sounds, orders, the clang of dragonglass weapons being sorted and distributed, the normal sounds of an army preparing. Jon breathed in the cold air. He thought about the name on the letter. The name he had been turning over in his hands for 2 weeks like something he'd found on a road, unfamiliar in shape, heavier than expected, obviously belonging to him but not yet worn in. When Daenerys arrives, Jon said, ideally before, Stannis said. When Daenerys arrives, Jon repeated firmly, and something in his voice said, this is the boundary and it's not moving. When she's here and we're all in the same room and we can do this once properly without, he stopped, without it becoming something people use to drive wedges, we do it together or we don't do it cleanly. Stannis looked at him for a long moment. 2 weeks, Stannis said. You need her here in 2 weeks. I know, Jon said, that's a very short window. I know. Jon looked north, the instinct he'd had his whole life, the pull of the wall somewhere over the hills, the thing he'd oriented himself by for so long it was practically a direction in him now. But she's coming, I can feel it. He paused. And the dragons, he stopped. What? Jon looked at the sky, gray clouds moving across gray sky, empty. Nothing, he said, just a feeling. He picked up the practice sword. 1 more hour, he said, and went back to the post, and the rhythm of it took him again. Cut, recover, footwork, cut. While the yard moved around him, and Stannis watched for a moment before turning back toward the castle with the measured efficiency of a man who has a great deal left to do and has just identified the next item on the list. The cold was deep and steady. The kind of cold that meant something serious had settled in, something that was not going to change. In the crypts below Winterfell, the stone faces of dead Starks stared at the walls they had always stared at, patient as only the dead can be. And above them in the yard, a living man with a dead man's name and 2 families' worth of history pressing down on him swung a practice sword at a wooden post and breathed cold air and waited for the world to arrive. It was coming from every direction, but so was he. Chapter 5, 2 fires, 1 throne. She came on a clear morning, which nobody had expected. The past week had been gray and closed, the sky low and heavy, with the particular northern winter that pressed down on everything like a hand on the back of your neck. And then the morning Daenerys Targaryen's fleet came around the headland toward White Harbor. The clouds broke. Just like that, not gradually, not with the slow theatrical parting of a stage curtain, but suddenly, the way a decision is made. 1 moment gray, the next a cold blue so sharp it hurt to look at directly, with the winter sun low on the horizon throwing long shadows across the snow. Jon saw the dragons before he saw the ships. He was on the battlements when they came, 3 shapes against the new blue sky, and even from miles away they were enormous, the kind of enormous that made every other large thing you'd ever seen seem like it was still in the process of becoming. They flew in a loose triangle formation, the largest one, the black one, slightly ahead and higher, and they moved with an ease that was unlike anything with wings had a right to move with, banking through turns that should have required more effort, riding thermals with the ancient familiarity of things that had been doing this since before men had names for it. Jon stood on the battlements and watched them and felt something that he had no immediate language for. Tormund appeared at his shoulder. The wildling stared at the dragons for a long moment. Bigger than I thought, he said. Yes, much bigger. Yes, Tormund, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Jon watched the black dragon bank left and angle south, and something happened in his chest, something physical, a pulling sensation like a compass finding north. He pressed his hand flat against the stone of the battlements and breathed carefully. You all right? Tormund said. Fine, Jon said. He wasn't entirely certain that was true. The fleet put in at White Harbor, and Daenerys rode north by horse rather than dragon, which Jon thought later was an intelligent choice. Arriving on Dragonback at Winterfell would have been a declaration before she'd had a chance to make an argument, and the letter had suggested she was smarter than declaration. She came with a small escort, Tyrion Lannister, whom Jon knew by reputation and not much else, 2 Dothraki bloodriders who had the particular quality of men who were keeping themselves visibly calm as a deliberate act, and Missandei, her advisor, who sat her horse with an ease that said she'd learned to ride later in life and decided that if she was going to do it, she was going to do it properly. The dragons stayed in the sky above White Harbor, waiting. Jon went down to the gate himself. He heard Sansa behind him as he descended the steps from the hall, the quiet sound of her following, not intrusively but positioning herself, the way she always positioned herself where she was needed before the need became apparent. He didn't tell her to stay back, he wouldn't have even if he'd wanted to. Stannis was already in the courtyard. He had positioned himself to one side with Davos, the deliberate placement of a man who wanted to be present and visible but was not going to make the entrance about himself. Jon noted this and was grateful for it in a way he didn't have time to express. The gates opened. Daenerys Targaryen rode through them on a gray horse, and Jon's first thought, before analysis, before politics, before any of the things he needed to think about, was that she looked like the people in the stories. Not in an idealized way, not in the way that songs made people look when they turned them into symbols. Just specifically, literally, the silver gold hair, the violet eyes that were the particular shade of winter twilight, the quality of someone who had been through extraordinary things and had not let those things make her smaller. She was younger than he'd expected, though he knew her age, 23. She looked it and didn't look it simultaneously. She pulled her horse to a stop in the center of the courtyard and looked at the assembled people, at Sansa, at Stannis, at Tormund and his wildlings along the wall, and then her eyes found Jon, and she looked at him with a directness that was itself a kind of conversation. He looked back. For a moment nobody spoke, which was the natural pause of 2 people who had been told significant things about each other by intermediaries and were now conducting the rapid recalibration of matching the actual person to the described one. Then Tyrion Lannister, from slightly behind her left shoulder, said, "Well, this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything, and I genuinely can't tell which." Something moved in Daenerys' face that was almost a smile. Jon felt something similar happen in his own face. "Jon Snow," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected and direct. "Your Grace," Jon said. "Don't," she said. It was the same word he had said to Melisandre in the ice cell, said with the same quality, not harsh, just clear. "Setting a boundary with someone who has assigned you a role you haven't agreed to yet. Not yet, not until we've talked." "All right," Jon said. "Come inside, it's cold." She almost smiled again. "I've heard. They took the solar." Just the 2 of them, which Sansa had arranged without being asked. She had simply ensured that the room was prepared, and then closed the door behind them with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood when presence was required and when it was the opposite. Jon made a note to thank her for it later, or possibly just to acknowledge it with a look, which was how he and Sansa communicated most of the important things. The fire was built up high. The maps were on the table, but not prominently, off to one side, a resource available rather than an agenda being presented. Jon poured wine for both of them and sat across from her and waited. He held her cup and looked around the room with the attentiveness of someone reading a space for information. "This was Ned Stark's solar," she said. "Yes, you grew up here, for the first 14 years of my life." He looked at the room too, briefly, the walls he'd known since before he could remember, the particular angle of light through the narrow window, then the wall, and then back here, and then back here. She looked at him. "The letter said you died, for one night, and came back, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've seen things that I once would have called impossible," she said, "so I'm not going to tell you I find that hard to believe." She paused. What was it like? Nobody had asked him that. Everyone had been careful not to ask him that. Sansa because she was giving him space, Stannis because it wasn't operationally relevant, Tormund because he had immediately accepted the resurrection as consistent with his general view of Jon as someone for whom normal rules didn't fully apply. Jon looked at her and considered the question. "Nothing," he said. "Complete nothing, not dark, not cold, just absence." He paused. "And then being back, which was," he stopped. "Loud," he said. "Everything was very loud after that." She looked at him steadily. Something in her expression said she understood that, in the way that people who have come back from their own versions of nothing understand it without requiring the specifics to match. "I read the letter many times," she said. "The information about your parents." "So did I. How does it feel?" He looked at his wine. "Like wearing someone else's coat," he said. "The right size but not broken in yet." He looked up at her. "Does that make sense? More than you know," she said quietly. He thought about what that meant for her, the identity she had built from the Targaryen name, the weight she had carried of being the last, the particular loneliness of being the end of something. And now she was not the last, and the end was not an end, and that should have been good news and probably was, but it also restructured everything she had organized herself around. "I'm not going to take your throne," he said. "That's not what I know it's not what you asked. I'm telling you anyway because it's the most important thing and I don't want it sitting in the room unsaid." He held her gaze. "I don't want it. I've had a crown of sorts. Lord Commander is not a crown, but it's a weight on the head, and I know what that does to a person. I've never looked at the Iron Throne and felt anything except relief that it wasn't my problem." He paused. "I have a problem. The dead are coming and they'll be at Winterfell in less than 2 weeks, and everything south of that is going to be irrelevant if we don't stop them here." She looked at him. "I need your dragons," he said simply. She was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know they're not weapons there." He stopped, trying to find the right language because he'd thought about this and found that the words kept almost being right and then not quite. "They're yours, I understand that. I'm asking you to trust me with something that I'll go with them," she said. "They're not a weapon you can pick up and point. They need me." "I know, you said you need the dragon. Do you know how to?" She stopped, looked at him with something shifting in her expression, something recalibrating. "There's something you're not telling me." He said nothing. Her eyes moved across his face. She was, he realized, very good at reading people, better than she should have to be, the kind of skill you developed when your survival had depended on it. "You feel something," she said, "about the dragons. You felt something since you saw them." He thought about lying. He dismissed it as quickly as he considered it, because lying to her specifically would cost more than it bought. "When they flew over this morning," he said carefully, "there was something I can't." He stopped. It was physical, like a pull. She stared at him. "I don't know what it means," he said. "I do," she said. She said it quietly, and the quiet of it was the quiet of something significant being confirmed rather than discovered. "Targaryens have always had." She stopped. "The dragons don't react to everyone the same way. With most people they're dangerous, unpredictable." She looked at him. "With family," the word sat between them, family. He had 2 families and he had lost most of both of them, and now here was a third possibility of the word, sitting across a table from him with violet eyes and silver hair and apparently a similar capacity for the kind of directness that people mistook for coldness. "We should find out," he said. "Now." She looked at the window. "After we've talked to the others, made a plan." He paused. "But soon, before the dead get here, because if that's—" He stopped. "If that's a thing that's real, we need to know it." She nodded slowly. "There's something else," Jon said. "Cersei," she said. "Just the name, flat and certain, the way you say the name of a problem you've known about for a long time. She knows about me. She'll have received intelligence the same time you did, probably earlier. She'll be making moves." He paused. "Your own Grage." Something moved in her face. "My fleet. Your fleet got here. But if she sends him after your supply lines, we deal with that when it happens," she said, with a calm that was not dismissiveness but decisiveness, the particular firmness of someone who has learned to sequence problems rather than carry all of them at once. "Right now we're here, the army is here, and the dead are 2 weeks away." She set her cup down. "Tell me about them, everything you know." So he did. He talked for an hour and she listened the way she did, everything, completely, with questions that were precise rather than numerous, asked at the right moments to clarify rather than derail. Tyrion, who was brought in after the first 20 minutes because some of this required logistical translation, sat in the corner and said very little and absorbed a great deal. When Jon finished, the room was very quiet. "Fire," Daenerys said. "Dragon fire kills them. Dragonglass kills the White Walkers. The Walkers control the Whites, kill the Walker, and the Whites it raised go down with it." Jon leaned over the map. "The Night King himself." "The source," she said. "If we can get to him, everything he's raised falls," she finished. She was looking at the map with the focused stillness of someone thinking through 3-dimensional problems in real time, which means the dragons need to target the Walkers, not the Whites. She paused. "And you need to get to the Night King." "Me specifically," Jon said. She looked up at him. "Valyrian steel," he said. He put his hand on the pommel of Longclaw. "It kills them the same way dragonglass does." "I've done it before." He held her gaze. "And he stopped. "There are people who believe I'm meant to be the one who faces him." "Melisandre," she said, "among others." "Do you believe it?" He thought about the honest answer. He thought about belief as a concept, what he had believed 2 months ago, what he believed now, what evidence had been brought to bear on the question of whether there was a pattern to events or just events. "I think," he said carefully, "that I'm the best person for it regardless of prophecy. I faced a White Walker, I know how they move, I know what they do." He looked at Longclaw. "And I died once already and it didn't take, so." Tyrion made a sound that was neither laugh nor cough, but occupied the territory between them. "They're Stannies," Daenerys said. "I need to speak to him. He knows, he's accepted the shape of this." She looked at him with a slight sharpening of attention. That easily. Stannis Baratheon does nothing easily, Jon said, but he does things correctly when he understands why they're correct. He's a just man, he's not. He paused. He wanted a just kingdom more than he ever actually wanted a crown. He'd never say that, but it's true. She considered this. I should speak to him directly. After we go to the dragons, Jon said. She looked at him. You're sure you want to do that? I want to know, he said. Whatever the answer is, I want to know the truth of it. She held his gaze for a moment, then she stood. Come on then, she said. They rode out to the field east of Winterfell where the dragons had settled, not landed, exactly, because landing implied a decision to stay, and what the dragons were doing was more like pausing, the way weather pauses before it decides its next form. They lay in the snow with the easy comfort of things that had no predators to worry about, their scales catching the low winter sun and throwing off light that was both cold and warm simultaneously, a trick of color that Jon couldn't explain. Drogon, the Black One, Daenerys' primary dragon, had his head up when they arrived. He watched Jon's approach with eyes that were the deep orange gold of coals at their most concentrated, and something happened in them when Jon came within 30 feet. A shift, a recognition. Jon stopped. He was aware of his heart doing something unusual. Not fear, he had been afraid of enough real things that he knew the specific quality of it, and this wasn't it. It was the physical version of the feeling he'd had on the battlements that morning, the compass-finding north feeling, but closer now and much stronger. Drogon lowered his head. Daenerys made a sound that was not quite audible, a soft intake of breath, barely a sound at all. Drogon lowered his enormous head to the snow level and watched Jon with those coal-fire eyes from perhaps 15 feet away, and the breath coming from his nostrils was warm on Jon's face even at that distance, the warmth of something that ran at a temperature several degrees higher than normal warm. Jon did not move toward him. He stood still and let the dragon look at him and looked back. One of the other dragons, the cream and gold one, Regal, moved from 30 meters away with a sound like a sail in heavy wind, pushing through the snow with its front legs, and came around Jon's left side to look at him from a different angle, which had the effect of surrounding Jon with the attention of two very large creatures that could have ended his existence in approximately one breath. He was not afraid. He was, if he was being honest about it, something much closer to the opposite. He took one step toward Drogon. Drogon did not move back. He took another, and another. And then he was standing in front of the dragon's lowered head with his hand raised, and Drogon's nose touched his palm, and the warmth of it ran up his arm and into his chest like a key turning in a lock. Behind him, Daenerys said something in Valyrian quietly, to no one in particular. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was the tone of someone whose understanding of the world has just been reorganized. Regal pressed the side of his snout against Jon's shoulder with the deliberate casualness of a large animal informing you that it has made a decision about you, and you are going to have to live with it. Jon stood between two dragons in a snow field outside Winterfell and felt, for the first time since a dead man's letter had given him a new name, that the name fit. Not because of the dragons, not because of some prophetic alignment or destiny being confirmed, but because Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark had made him with the full weight of two great bloodlines, and he had spent his entire life wondering why certain things in him had no source, why he felt at ease in places other people found frightening, why the cold had never quite touched him the way it touched others, why fire had always seemed less like danger and more like home. There it was. He took his hand back from Drogon's nose, turned and looked at Daenerys. She was watching him with an expression he didn't entirely have language for, complicated and deep and moving through several things simultaneously, some of which were clearly difficult and some of which were clearly not. She was standing in the snow with her silver hair loose and the winter light on her face, and she looked in this moment exactly like someone who has been alone with something for a very long time and has just realized they aren't anymore. "Regal," she said. "My brother's dragon, I know," Jon said. "He's never let anyone else near him." Jon looked at the cream and gold dragon who was still pressing against his shoulder with the relaxed confidence of something that has made up its mind. "Not anyone," he said, "not anyone." They stood there for a moment in the snow, the two of them and three dragons, with Winterfell behind them and the sky clear and blue above and the dead coming from the north at a pace that didn't care about any of this. "We should go inside," Jon said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved immediately. Cersei's move came that evening, which was either coincidence or very good intelligence, and given Cersei Lannister's track record, Jon was prepared to believe it was the latter. The Raven arrived as they were in the Great Hall. Jon, Daenerys, Stannis, Sansa, Davos, Tyrion, Melisandre, Tormund, assembled around the hall's long table with maps and supply reports and the specific focused energy of people who have accepted that they are managing the last days before a battle they cannot afford to lose. The Maester, one of Stannis' men, came in and gave the message to Jon without ceremony. Jon read it and passed it to Sansa without speaking. She read it and her face did the thing it did with bad information, not flinching, just settling, the way a good structure settles into itself when weight is applied. Your own Grage's fleet engaged a portion of Daenerys' remaining ships near Dragonstone, she said, her voice was steady. The message is from our contact in the harbor. 3 ships burned. The Iron Fleet has the straits. Daenerys went very still. How many men? She said. The message doesn't specify. My Dothraki, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Part of her forces, part of the people who had crossed an ocean with her, gone to fire and water for Cersei Lannister's calculated move. Tyrion had his hands flat on the table. She waited, he said. She waited until your fleet had partially dispersed after landing, and she sent Euron. She knew the dragons were north. He looked at the ceiling briefly. She's trying to cut your retreat. There is no retreat, Daenerys said. The flatness of it was complete. Tyrion looked at her. I'm not going back south to deal with Euron Greyjoy while the dead are 2 weeks from this castle, she said. Cersei Lannister can have the straits. She can have Dragonstone. She looked around the table. She's made a calculation that will split our forces, that I'll take the dragons south and Jon defends the north with what's left. She looked at Jon directly. That's what she thinks we'll do. It's what I would do in her position, Sansa said quietly. Which is why she thought it, Jon said. Cersei is excellent at predicting what reasonable people will do in unreasonable situations. He looked at the map. She's not as good at predicting what people will do when they've decided to be unreasonable. The dead, Stannis said. He had been quiet through the exchange, watching, which was how Stannis participated in conversations that didn't yet require his input. If we don't stop them here, there is nothing to go south to. Cersei holds King's Landing behind its walls and calls herself queen of a kingdom of corpses. He looked up. She has not thought the dead through. She has not seen them. She is treating them as a factor to exploit rather than a threat to the living world. Which is Cersei's fundamental problem, Tyrion said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite sad and not quite bitter, but was the specific combination of both that you get from knowing someone very well and watching them make the same mistake in larger and larger theaters. When the north is secure, Jon said, when the dead are beaten and they will be beaten, we go south together. He looked at Daenerys. All of us together, she held his gaze, and Cersei answers for everything she's done. He said it plainly, without heat. That's not vengeance, that's consequence. And the throne, she asked it carefully, not as a challenge, as a genuine question from someone who needed to know the shape of what came after before she could commit to the shape of what came before it. Stannis made a sound that was the Stannis equivalent of clearing his throat. There was a discussion, he said, an agreement. Daenerys looked at him. Governance settled properly, Stannis said. Council, structure, not the strongest person on the pile. He looked at Daenerys with the directness he brought to all things. You want to break the wheel, I'm told. I do. Then don't build a new one after the war. He held her gaze. Build something different. I'll help you if you'll have that help. She looked at Stannis' Baratheon hard man, just man, the king who had lost everything and was still here, and something moved through her face that was recognition. Not of him specifically, of the type. The person who wants things to be right more than they want things to be theirs. I'll have it, she said. Jon looked at both of them. He thought about Ned Stark, who had died for a truth he was trying to protect. He thought about Rhaegar, who had loved someone honestly in a world that punished honesty. He thought about Lyanna, who had made a dying woman's promise and entrusted it to a man who kept it for the rest of his life. He thought about what all of that had been building toward, whether it was building toward anything or just the random accumulation of events that humans retrospectively organized into meaning. He thought it was probably the latter. And then he thought, but meaning is what you make from what you're given, and here he was, given an impossible amount of it, and the only question was whether he was going to use it or waste it. All right, he said, let's plan a battle. Melisandre spoke at the end of the planning session, when the maps had been marked and the strategies agreed, and people were beginning to push back from the table with the specific exhaustion of minds that had been working at full capacity for several hours. She spoke not to the group but to Jon, and she did it quietly enough that only he and Daenerys, sitting nearest to her, heard clearly. I saw you in the fire, she said, both of you. She looked from Jon to Daenerys. For years I looked for the warrior of light and saw only one person, and I was wrong about which one it was. She paused. I see now that I was wrong in a different way. It was never one person. The flames showed me two, and I read it as one because I was looking for a simpler story. She held their gazes in turn. There is no single hero. There is no one chosen person. She paused. There are two. Jon looked at her. Don't, he said. She nodded. Yes, she said. I know. She folded her hands. I am simply telling you what I see. What you do with it is, as always, entirely your own. He looked at Daenerys. She was looking at him with an expression that was tired and sharp, and under both of those things something warmer that neither of them had had the time or the space to address yet and probably wouldn't for some time, given the dead coming south and Cersei's fleet and the full weight of everything currently pressing on both their respective lives. Later, he thought. There was a later. There had to be a later because he refused to plan for anything else. Get some sleep, he told the room. All of you. Tomorrow we finish preparations, and in 2 weeks we fight. He looked around the table at all of them. Stannis, straight-backed and resolved, Davos, practical and steady, Sansa, who was already writing something on a small piece of parchment with the focused energy of a person who never truly stopped working, Tormund, who was eating, Tyrion, who was drinking but watching everything with sharp eyes, Melisandre, red and quiet at the edge of things. His people. A strange, impossible, assembled collection of people who had each followed their own road to this hall, and this table, and this terrible and necessary moment. Get some sleep, he said again. Outside, the 3 dragons folded themselves tighter against the cold, and the stars came out over Winterfell for the first time in a week, clear and bright and excessive in number, the way they always were this far north, away from the glow of anything man-made. And north of the wall, in the dark that had no stars, the dead walked on. Chapter 6, Aegon's name. They came on a Thursday. Not that the day of the week mattered to the dead, but Jon would remember it as a Thursday because Sansa had written the date at the top of her morning correspondence, and he had glanced at it while she was reading reports aloud, and the mundane specificity of it stayed with him afterward, the fact that the end of the world had arrived on a perfectly ordinary day of the week, while somewhere south of the Neck people were probably arguing about grain prices. The scouts came back at dawn, 3 riders who had gone north the previous evening and returned at a hard gallop with their horses wide-eyed and lathered, and their own faces carrying the particular expression of people who have seen something that has permanently rearranged their understanding of scale. 2 miles, the lead rider said. He was breathing in ragged pulls, maybe less, moving fast. Jon was already in his armor. He had slept 4 hours, which was enough. He had found over the years that the body made do with what it got when it understood there was no alternative, and his body had excellent situational awareness. He had been awake before the scouts returned, standing at Winterfell's north wall with Ghost beside him in the dark pressing in from all directions, feeling what was coming the way you feel weather before it arrives, not in the air exactly, but in the quality of the silence, in the way sound was behaving, in the animal certainty of something that has learned to trust its own instincts. He turned from the rider and looked up at the sky. The dragons were already there. He hadn't called them. He would think about that later. But they were circling above Winterfell in the pre-dawn dark, 3 dark shapes against the slightly less dark of the sky, and they were moving in tight, urgent patterns, and Regal peeled away from the formation and dove low over the north wall and pulled up 30 feet above Jon with a sound of displaced air that flattened the snow in a circle around him. Jon looked up at the dragon. Regal looked down at him. Something passed between them that was not language. Jon had spent enough time with Ghost to understand communication that didn't require words, the specific warmth of being known by something that had chosen to know you. He felt it now, amplified, deeper, ancient in a way that Ghost's wolf bond was not. The dragon pulled up and banked north, and Jon felt the pull of it in his chest like a physical thing. Jon, Daenerys was behind him, already mounted, already in her armor, the black scaled coat she wore when she rode, her silver hair braided back and pinned. She looked at Regal and then at Jon's face. He's ready. I know. Can you ride him? Jon looked at the dragon banking in the dark above them. He thought about the answer, stripped of performance and pretension, just the honest assessment. Yes, he said. He said it the way he said things he was certain of, which was quietly. She looked at him for a moment. The Night King will have an ice javelin, she said. He threw one at Viserion beyond the wall. He has range and accuracy. She held his gaze. Don't stay still. I'll keep moving. Jon, something in her voice shifted just slightly. The voice of someone saying something that has been waiting to be said and has run out of time to wait any longer. Come back from this. He looked at her. We have things to discuss afterward, she said, and her tone was the tone of someone using practicality as a container for something that wouldn't otherwise fit in a sentence. Important things. I know, he said. He turned and walked to where Regal had landed at the base of the north wall, folding himself into the snow with the specific patience of something that has decided to wait for a particular person. The dragon was enormous up close, the scales cream and copper gold, each one the size of a man's hand, the eyes yellow-green and lit from inside with something that was not reflected light. Jon put his hand on the dragon's neck and felt the warmth of him through his gauntlet and climbed. It was easier than it should have been. That was the only thought he had time for before Regal launched. The dead came out of the dark in a wave. Not a line, a wave, the way water comes, without gaps, without the spaces that living armies always have between men. They covered the ground north of Winterfell with the absolute density of something that doesn't require space to breathe or rest or maintain morale. Blue eyes, all of them the same cold blue, ordered by the same cold will. They moved in silence, which was the worst part, the detail that stayed with the living soldiers who survived and talked about it afterward. An army of that size should have been audible, the ground should have shaken, but they came in a silence that was worse than noise, the silence of things that had left the world of sound behind. The living were waiting for them. Stannis had positioned his forces through the night with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for battles. The infantry held the approaches to Winterfell's gates in 3 lines, the first line armed with dragonglass spears and long pikes, the second line with dragonglass blades for the close work, the third line as reserve and emergency response. The wildlings held the flanks, which was where Tormund had argued they should be, loudly and at length, on the grounds that wildlings had been fighting these things for years, and the flanks were where battles turned, and he wanted to be where battles turned. Stannis had agreed with him, which had surprised Tormund so thoroughly that he'd stood in silence for almost 5 full seconds, which was a personal record. The archers on the walls had fire arrows, the gates were triple barred, the ditches outside the walls held oil and kindling, and the men with torches were waiting for the order. Sansa was in the crypts below Winterfell with the civilians they hadn't been able to evacuate, children, elderly, the wounded from previous engagement. She had gone there without argument and without making it seem like a lesser role, because she understood that keeping the living alive in the crypts was as tactically essential as anything happening above ground, and because she had been in enough terrible situations to know that survival sometimes required choosing the task that would feel insufficient while it was happening. She had also, before going below, given Jon a look that contained an entire conversation's worth of things in approximately 2 seconds. He had understood all of it. The first wave hit the ditches at dawn. The fire went up in a wall that lit the whole north face of Winterfell orange, and for a moment the dead stopped, not from fear, they had no fear, but from the physical fact of fire, which was a problem even for things that didn't flinch. The whites at the front burned. The whites behind them pushed forward through the burning ones with the absolute indifference of a force that didn't count its own losses, and the fire began to be smothered by the sheer mass of bodies pushing through it. That was when the dragons hit. Jon had never flown before in his life, and he would think later that there was something perfect about the fact that his first flight was in battle, because anything calmer would have given him time to be afraid of it, and fear in this context would have been a problem. Instead, he was simply in the air on Regal's back, and the ground was very far below and moving very fast, and the cold was extraordinary at this altitude, the kind of cold that went past pain into something else entirely. He held on. Regal understood what was required without being directed, which was the thing Jon hadn't fully expected, that the dragon wasn't a weapon waiting to be aimed, but a mind that grasped the situation and acted within it. Regal dove on the mass of the dead from the east, hit them with fire in a long sweeping pass that turned a section of the army to ash in seconds, and pulled up and banked before the counterfire could organize. Across the field, Drogon was doing the same from the west, with Daenerys small and precise on his back, visible as a dark shape against the fire. The dead burned. They burned in their thousands, and the whites that the dragons raised were the whites themselves, indifferent to dying a second time, pushing forward into the fire and continuing forward and burning more. The Night King had numbers in the tens of thousands, and he was not afraid to spend them. Jon watched the battle from above and looked for the walkers. They were in the rear. He had known they would be. In every engagement Jon had studied, and in the logic of what they were, the walkers directed from behind, pushing the mass forward from a distance, cold commanders in a cold army. He could see them now from Regal's height, 7 of them, arranged in a loose formation behind the main body, their ice-blue armor catching the firelight from the burning dead in front of them and throwing it back colder. And behind the 7, further still, barely visible in the dark, a single figure on a dead horse, the Night King. Jon touched Regal's neck with his left hand. The dragon knew. The dive was vertical. Regal folded his wings and dropped like a stone from 400 feet, and the ground came up at a speed that was beyond anything Jon had vocabulary for, and he pressed himself against the dragon's neck and felt the wind trying to strip him from his seat and held on with everything he had. The walkers saw them coming. Ice lances formed in their hands, the same crystalline spears he had seen used against Viserion beyond the wall, and they threw. Two of them, three, the projectiles trailing cold vapor, aimed at Regal with the accuracy of things that had been practicing violence longer than Westeros had been a kingdom. Regal twisted in the air, a movement that should have been impossible for something his size, and two of the lances missed clean, and one struck his left wing and punched through scale and membrane with a sound like a cannon shot. And Regal screamed, a sound that Jon felt in his sternum as much as heard, and they both turned it into a roll. The dragon spinning through the air so that the screaming became banking, and the banking became a different attack angle, and they hit the Walker formation not from above but from the side, Regal's tail clearing three of them like a hand sweeping pieces from a table. Jon was off the dragon's back before he had consciously decided to be. He landed in the snow 15 feet from a walker and rolled and came up with Longclaw in his hand. The walker was there immediately, no hesitation, no fear, the cold that came before it arriving like a weather front. It raised its own blade, ice formed to an edge that was sharper than anything forged, and it moved with the speed that Jon had remembered from Hardhome and had been thinking about every day since, the specific terrible speed of something that had no muscle fatigue and no self-preservation and nothing in its movements except the pure mechanics of violence. Jon moved to meet it. He had spent 16 years training with a sword. He had been killed and resurrected. He had flown on a dragon and survived a fall that should have broken both his legs and had not, because certain things about him were apparently different now, and he was going to think about that later. He had Ghost's eyes in the back of his mind, the wolf sense he had carried since childhood that gave him a half-second of peripheral awareness beyond normal human range. The walker swung. Jon went under it inside the swing's reach and put Longclaw through its chest. The ice exploded. 3 walkers still standing. He had Regal behind him making the ground shake as the dragon dealt with 2 of them in the most direct way available. Jon was already moving toward the 4th, and the battle around him was noise and fire and the screaming of living people and the absolute silence of the dead, and he went through all of it like a stone through water, not stopping, not slowing, not thinking about anything except the next thing and the Night King at the end of all of it. He got to the Night King. He was going to think later about how he got through the remaining distance, through the whites that had turned toward him at the Night King's direction, through the cold that intensified with every step in that direction until it was genuinely painful in a way the northern cold had never been, through the space between him and the figure on the dead horse that seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, the way distances in nightmares refused to behave like distances. He got there. That was the fact of it. The Night King dismounted. He was taller than Jon. He was always taller than Jon had expected, every time he encountered him, as if the mind refused to properly retain the memory of that height because it was outside the range of normal human variation. He had a face that had once been a man's face and still wore the architecture of one, but the expression on it was not any human expression. It was the expression of deep winter, of absolute cold, of silence so complete it had become a position. He looked at Jon. He raised his hand. The dead around them stopped. Jon stood in the sudden stillness with Longclaw in his hand and looked at the Night King and understood in a way that was below thought that what was about to happen was not a battle in the normal sense. It was something older, something that the word battle didn't fully fit. The Night King reached to his side and formed an ice lance in his hand with the ease of a man drawing a sword from a scabbard. Jon moved. He threw Longclaw. Not at the Night King, at the ice lance, at the hand holding it, a throw that he had never practiced and that his body performed with a confidence that his mind had no part in, the precise muscle knowledge of a man who had been training to fight since he was 7 years old and whose body knew things his conscious mind would never catch up to. Longclaw hit the lance and shattered it. Jon was already inside the swing. He hit the Night King with his shoulder, both of them going down in the snow, and he got his hands on the Night King's chest, on the ice armor, on the cold that was trying to stop his heart through his palms, through the gauntlets that were already cracking with the cold, and he felt the sword that Stannis' men had pulled from the armory at Winterfell, the dragon-glass blade he had kept in his belt as secondary armament, come out of his belt in his right hand. He drove it in. The Night King went still. Not with the explosion that the lesser walkers made, not the shattering of ice. Something deeper and slower, a stillness that spread from the point of impact outward, the way cold spreads, the way silence spreads, reaching out from that central point through every dead thing in every direction in a wave that Jon could not see but could feel in the ground beneath him and in the air and in the sudden changed quality of the world. He heard it happen. Not sound, the absence of sound. The absolute cessation of the particular silence of the dead, which was different from ordinary silence because it had intention in it. and when the intention stopped, the silence stopped too, and what replaced it was the ordinary silence of a winter night, empty of direction and meaning, just air and cold and snow. Jon sat in the snow with his hands on the Night King's chest and felt the thing beneath his hands stop being the Night King and become something else. Not a man, not a monster, just ice, just cold, just the ground asserting itself as the ground under the weight of one more thing that had ended. He breathed again. He looked up. The battle had ended. Not with a shout or a rallying cry or any of the things that battles ended with in songs. It ended with the cessation, the whites dropping where they stood, the sudden absence of the force that had been moving them, the silence that replaced the noise as completely as morning replaces night. The living stood in the field north of Winterfell and looked at what was around them and tried to understand what had just happened. Tormund was the first to make any sound. He let out a yell that was either celebration or the release of an hour's worth of compressed terror, possibly both, that carried across the entire field and seemed to give the surviving soldiers permission to feel whatever they had been holding back. The sound that followed was the sound of people who had been certain they were going to die and had discovered they weren't, raw and broken and real, nothing like the songs. Jon got to his feet. Rhaegal landed beside him with a sound like a small earthquake, folding his wings carefully, the wound in his left wing visible now, ragged at the edges, smoking faintly but not structural. Dragons healed, Daenerys had told him. Not quickly, but they healed. Drogon came from the west and landed 40 feet away, and Daenerys was off his back and running through the snow toward Jon before the dragon had fully settled. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him, checking, her eyes moving fast across him, looking for the damage, finding less of it than she'd expected. "You're all right," she said, "mostly. The Night King, gone." He looked at the field, at the collapsed whites, the thousands of them, the vast disordered stillness of an army that had stopped being an army. All of them, gone. She looked at the field, too. Something moved through her face that was not triumph exactly, or not only triumph, it was the more complex thing, the thing that comes after the moment you've been building toward your entire life, when the moment arrives and you're standing in it, and it is exactly what it was supposed to be and also nothing like you'd imagined. She turned back to him. "You threw Longclaw," she said. "It worked out. You threw your sword at the Night King. The ice lance was the problem. Longclaw solved the problem." She looked at him with the expression she was developing for his particular approach to tactical decision-making, which appeared to involve doing whatever his body had decided to do and then explaining it afterward. "We are going to talk about that," she said. "I know," he said. She put her hand on his arm briefly, the gesture of someone confirming that the person is present and solid, not a confirmation of anything else or not yet. He covered her hand with his own for a moment. Then Tormund arrived like weather, and the moment ended. The hall that night was the loudest Jon had ever heard Winterfell. It was the specific noise of people who had survived something unsurvivable, the noise of the living insisting on being alive with everything they had, food and drink, and the sound of voices at full volume, talking over each other, telling stories that had just happened as if the telling would finish making them real. Wildlings and knights and Stannis' soldiers and the people who'd come out of the crypts, all of them together in the great hall with the fires burning high and the sound of it reaching up through the old stone of the castle into the winter night. Jon sat at the head of the table. He was aware of what that meant and did not comment on it. Sansa had placed him there, which meant it was the right place, and he trusted her placement with the same confidence he trusted her political judgment in general. Stannis sat to his left. He was drinking, which was unusual for Stannis, though he was drinking in a controlled way that suggested he had thought about whether to drink and decided it was warranted. He had said almost nothing since the battle, which was also the Stannis way, processing rather than performing. Daenerys was to his right. She was talking to Tyrion across the table with the focused attention she brought to everything, but she glanced at Jon occasionally in the way of someone who has a separate, ongoing conversation running in parallel to the one they're in, and Jon glanced back in the way of someone who is aware of this. Sansa sat slightly down the table with Davos across from her, the two of them talking in low voices over what were almost certainly political documents, because Sansa considered victory a reason to work harder rather than a reason to rest. She caught Jon's eye once and gave him a look that said, "Later, when it's quieter, we need to talk." He nodded. He looked down the table at all of it, Tormund with his arm around a wildling woman who was ignoring him with cheerful contempt, the Vale Knights cautiously attempting wildling food, Melisandre at the far end like a red coal, watching everything with those deep eyes that were, Jon thought, genuinely at peace for the first time since he'd known her. He thought about the North, which would rebuild now. Which had always rebuilt generation after generation, because that was what the North did. It endured and it rebuilt and it remembered. He thought about the South, which still had Cersei in it. He let that thought sit. Not tonight, he told it. Tonight was not for that. Tonight was for this, for the fire and the noise and the fact of being alive in a room full of people who were also alive. He picked up his cup. Tormund, who missed very little, noticed immediately and got to his feet with his own cup raised and his voice at a volume that genuinely did not require the hall to be quiet for people to hear it. "Jon Snow," he bellowed. The hall went quiet, which was an impressive trick. Jon looked at Tormund. "You died," Tormund said conversationally, at the volume of a man who has decided that personal topics are appropriate for general announcement. "And you came back, and then you killed the god of death." He paused. "I've been saying for years that you're not entirely normal, and I wanted acknowledged that I was right." The hall laughed. Even Stannis made a sound that was the mechanical precursor to a laugh, though it didn't quite complete the journey. Jon stood up. He hadn't planned to. The standing was its own decision made by the same part of him that had thrown Longclaw at the ice lance, the part that knew things before his mind caught up. He looked at the hall. All these faces. Wildlings who had come through the wall on his word, who had believed him when he said the dead were real before anyone south of it had reason to believe anything. Stannis' soldiers who had ridden into the north on the word of a king who had refused to give up. Sansa's Vale Knights, strangers to all of this, here because Sansa had asked them, and because Sansa had the judgment that made people follow when she asked. Davos, Tyrion, Melisandre, Daenerys. Jon looked at Daenerys. She looked back at him. He made a decision. "My name," he said, "is Aegon Targaryen." The hall went absolutely still. "Son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, trueborn." "Legitimate," he said each word clearly, not loudly, but with a weight that the hall's silence carried to its furthest corners. "I've been Jon Snow my whole life, and I'll be Jon Snow until I'm in the ground, because that's the name my father gave me, and my father was Ned Stark, and that means more to me than any throne or bloodline or prophecy that anyone cares to mention." He paused. "But the other name is also true, and I'm done keeping it hidden because hidden things have a cost, and this particular thing has cost enough." Nobody spoke. "The dead are gone," Jon said. "Cersei Lannister still sits in King's Landing behind her walls, planning how to outlast whatever survives up here. She has Euron Greyjoy's fleet and the Lannister gold and the patience of someone who has always bet on other people destroying each other." He looked around the table. "We're not going to destroy each other." He looked at Daenerys. "We're going to go south together." She held his gaze steadily, with something in her expression that was the closest thing to certainty he had seen on her face. "But first," he said, and here he looked at Sansa, who was watching him with an expression that was composed and precise, and had something behind it that was not composed at all. "We do it right, council, lords, the proper process." He looked at Stannis. "As agreed." Stannis gave the single nod that was his version of full endorsement. "The question of who rules the Seven Kingdoms," Jon said, "is a question for the Seven Kingdoms to answer, not for one sword or one dragon or one name." He looked at the room. "But right now, tonight, that question can wait." He raised his cup. "Right now the dead are gone and we're alive, and this is Winterfell." The cheer that followed was the kind that started in the chest rather than the throat, the kind that came from somewhere below performance, from the actual weight of relief finding its release. It went on for a while, and Jon stood and let it go on and felt it in his bones, the specific warmth of a room full of people deciding to be grateful for the fact of existing. Daenerys touched his arm. He leaned toward her and she spoke close to his ear over the noise. "That was well done," she said. "Sansa wrote notes," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched you not look at them once." He straightened up and looked at her. She was close, which was the natural consequence of the noise in the hall requiring proximity to be heard, and she looked at him with those violet eyes and the particular directness that was the thing he had recognized in her earliest, before he'd understood what it was, the directness of someone who had stopped being careful about wanting things because being careful had cost too much. "The things we need to discuss," she said. "After Cersei," he said, "that could take months." "It could, Jon." "We'll find time," he said. And he meant it in the way he meant things that mattered, not as a deflection but as a promise, the same quality his promises always had, which was the quality of a man who understood that what you pledged yourself to defined what you were. She held his gaze. "All right," she said. The hall roared on around them. Later, when the fires had burned lower and the noise had softened to the comfortable rumble of people winding down from enormous things, Jon went up to the walls. He stood on the north wall of Winterfell in the cold and looked at the field below, cleared now, the dead gone, the snow already beginning to cover the traces of what had happened there. In a month you wouldn't know, except that you would, because the people who had been here would carry it in their bodies forever, the specific weight of a night when the world had almost ended and then hadn't. Ghost appeared from somewhere and pressed against his leg, warm and vast and silently insistent. Jon put his hand on the direwolf's head. He looked north. The wall was still there. He could feel it, the way he had always felt it, the enormous cold presence of it at the edge of the world. It would need to be managed differently now. The threat it had been built to hold was gone, but the wall was old and its purposes were old, and the management of old things was its own kind of work. He heard footsteps on the steps behind him. He didn't turn. Sansa came to stand beside him. She looked north too for a moment, and then she looked at him. "You said it," she said, "the name. Yes, how did it feel?" He thought about that. He thought about the moment of saying it, the specific sensation, what happened in him when the words left his mouth. He had expected it to feel like putting something on, a weight, a mantle, the heavy thing he had been resisting since Sam's letter arrived. It hadn't felt like that, like putting something down, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly in the way of someone whose own understanding of something has just been confirmed by someone else's experience. "The lords will need to be addressed formally," she said. "There will be a council and it will be complicated and Littlefinger will try to insert himself into Sansa." She stopped. "Not tonight," he said. She looked at him. Then she looked north, at the dark and the cold and the wall somewhere out there in the distance, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. "No," she said, "not tonight." They stood together on the wall of their father's castle in the cold, the two of them, stark and stark, and the night was quiet in the way that nights were quiet when they were genuinely quiet, and not just the quiet of something gathering itself to strike. This was just the night, just ordinary cold, just stars. Jon looked up at them. The stars over Winterfell were what they had always been, excessive, brilliant, indifferent to everything happening below them in the way that things sufficiently old and sufficiently constant were indifferent to the brief, urgent dramas of the living world. He had been born under those stars, probably. In a tower in Dorne while a war ended outside, born to a woman who was dying in a name that was too large for a newborn, given to a man who carried it south and kept it hidden for the rest of his life because love asked him to. He had lived under those stars in Winterfell as Jon Snow, as Ned's bastard, as the boy who wanted to be a knight and became a steward and then a ranger and then a lord commander and then a dead man and then something that didn't have a clean category. He would stand under those same stars going south, toward King's Landing and Cersei and the last piece of a war that had been waiting to be finished. He would stand under them as Aegon when it mattered and Jon when it mattered and himself always, in the spaces between names where the actual person lived. He would stand under them with Daenerys when they found the time. He would stand under them until he didn't. That was enough. He thought of his father, both of them, the one who made him and the one who kept him, Rhaegar who had loved honestly in a world that punished it, and Ned who had honored that love past his own death. He felt them both in the cold, the way you feel the dead when you stand in a place they loved, not as ghosts, not as weights, just as the specific warmth of knowing that you came from something real. "I miss him," Sansa said quietly. She didn't say which one because with them it was always clear. "So do I," Jon said. They stood there until the cold made staying impractical, and then they went inside, and the fires were still burning in Winterfell's great hall, and the people who were alive were still alive, and the work that remained was large and complicated and urgent and entirely possible. He went to it. 3 weeks later, the army moved south. It went under a banner that Sansa had designed and that the seamstresses of Winterfell had worked through 3 consecutive nights to produce. A grey direwolf on white, which was the Stark banner, and below it a 3-headed dragon on black, which was the Targaryen sigil, and between them interlocked, the stitching that tied them together so that neither consumed the other but both were visible and both were real. Jon rode at the head of it on a grey horse, with Ghost loping at his side. Daenerys rode with him, and Drogon and Rhaegal's wing healed enough for flight, not fully but enough, crossed overhead in lazy circles, their shadows moving across the column below with the particular grandeur of things that don't try to be grand and therefore simply are. Stannis rode on Jon's left. He was in his black armor, and he looked at the road ahead with the expression of a man who has simplified himself down to his essential purpose and found that the simplification fits. He had given up something enormous, Jon knew, not just the throne but the story he had told himself about the throne, the meaning he had built from 20 years of insisting on his own righteousness. Giving that up was a different kind of courage from anything displayed in battle, and Jon had not said this to Stannis and would not say it to Stannis, because Stannis would find the acknowledgement condescending. But he knew. Davos rode behind them with a face that was, for the first time in Jon's experience of it, entirely at peace. The face of a man whose king has finally, after extraordinary delay, decided to be the best version of himself. Sansa had stayed at Winterfell, which was the right decision, and she had made it herself before Jon could think it through. Someone needed to hold the North. Someone with the specific Stark authority and the specific political intelligence and the specific capacity to deal with Littlefinger, who remained in Winterfell like an unresolved problem that Sansa was going to resolve in her own time and on her own terms, and that Jon trusted her to handle with the complete confidence of a man who had watched his sister become more capable than him at most things that mattered. She had stood at the gate when they rode out. He had looked back once. She had raised her hand just once, and then turned and gone back inside and started governing. He faced forward. The road went south through the white country, through the brown country, through the world coming back to itself after the longest winter, and the army behind him was enormous and alive, and moving with the specific energy of people who had done the hardest thing and knew they had more hard things ahead of them, and had decided to do those too. Cersei was waiting in King's Landing. She was behind her walls with her gold and her plans and her capacity for survival that Jon genuinely respected, even as he understood that it had to end. She would have heard about the North by now. She would be working every lever she had. She would not be giving up without forcing them to take everything from her one piece at a time, and she would make that process as costly as she could, because that was who she was, someone who had never once in her life gone quietly into anything. He would not underestimate her. He would not be afraid of her. He would go to King's Landing and do what was necessary in the same way he had done everything else that was necessary, without ceremony, without ego, with the plain, direct purposefulness of a man who understood that the world needed things done, and that he was presently the person available to do them. He was Aegon Targaryen and Jon Snow and Ned Stark's son and Rhaegar's heir, and the man the dragons chose, and the Lord Commander who had given his watch everything, and the king in the north who hadn't asked to be, and the person who was going to sit down with Daenerys Targaryen in some quiet moment and have a conversation that was long overdue. He was all of those things simultaneously, which was messy and complicated and entirely, fundamentally real. Above him, Regal called out, a long, high sound that carried across the column and across the fields and up into the winter-ending sky, and it was answered immediately by Drogon from further south, the two of them talking in whatever language dragons used, and the sound of it moved through Jon like fire through cold. He rode south. The world turned under him like it always had and always would. And the name he carried, all of it, every syllable of it, rang out clear and permanent and true across everything it touched, like a bell that had finally, after a very long time in the dark, been rung.